In late December 2021, a dark new narrative on the martyrdom of the prophet Joseph Smith and his brother Hyrum emerged from the shadows. A man named Justin Griffin wrote and produced a movie framing John Taylor and Willard Richards for the deaths of the two prophets. Over the next 3 hours, our panel of experts will debunk who killed Joseph Smith using documented historical facts, real ballistics, and real forensics. In the first hour, we uncover and explain the real conspiracy and plot to kill the prophet Joseph Smith by both friends and foes. We have discovered two key hidden historical documents which prove who pulled the trigger killing Joseph Smith at Carthage. We then move on to two professional forensic and ballistic experts who disprove with irrefutable evidence Justin Griffin's inside job theory. And finally, we conclude with a doctrinal presentation on how to identify wolves in sheep's clothing in order to avoid being deceived. And we use Justin Griffin and his movie, Who Killed Joseph Smith, as our case study. Stay with us to the end, and you will not be disappointed.
Hi, my name's Shannon Tracy, and my partner here is Kimberly Smith. We're here to discuss a very important topic, which is the martyrdom of Joseph Smith. And our purpose here is to debunk Justin Griffith's movie, which is called Who Killed Joseph Smith. And our purpose is to go through the historical record and documentation of the martyrdom, both of the conspiracy out of Nauvoo and the conspiracy out of Warsaw, and clearly show what was going on and who was involved with it and how long it was going on. Then we will also then at that point, after we've established the historical perspective, we will talk about the forensic styles and the true way to actually perform a forensic analysis of a crime scene. And that will be performed by Jim Tracy and Sam Weston. And then towards the end of our podcast, we're going to bring Taylor Smith in. It's going to talk to us a little about how to discern the wolves in sheep's clothing. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the time over to Brian to launch us off on the historical perspective.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm Brian Stutzman. I've researched Hancock County for many years. I wrote I wrote the history of Warsaw, Illinois, and Warsaw is a little river town 18 miles south of Nauvoo. You can see this in this map between Nauvoo and Carthage and Warsaw. It kind of makes up an 18-mile triangle. Warsaw was a town where the mob came from that stormed Carthage jail. There was 2 battalions, 2 military regiments from Warsaw and one from nearby Green Plains, but they met in Warsaw before they came to Carthage. Probably the most famous figure when it comes to our church history is and dealing with martyrdom is Thomas Sharp. And the reason we're going to do a little historical deep dive here is that the martyrdom wasn't just an afterthought or something that happened without any planning. This was a well thought out political assassination that was months or even years in the making. And anybody familiar with the facts and does the research will see how much Thomas Sharp was involved in the assassination and the planning and in the riling up of people against the church and against Joseph Smith personally and specifically. Thomas Sharp was just a young man in his young 20s when he came to Warsaw, and he published on and off the Warsaw Signal newspaper. He, as early as 1841, he got into a big tiff with Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith wrote that basically we would use the term stalker today. Thomas Sharp was Joseph Smith's stalker. And he was, Joseph Smith subscribed to the newspapers around, including the Warsaw Signal. And when Thomas Sharp just really went off against Joseph, Joseph wrote this letter, and they published it in the front page of the Warsaw Signal. Back then, people who were publishers wrote both positive and negative things that came to them. Joseph Smith said, "You will discontinue my paper. Its contents are calculated to pollute me, and to patronize that filthy sheet, that tissue of lies, that sink of iniquity, is disgraceful to any mortal man." That was in 1841. Below, Thomas Sharp in the newspaper quipped a little jab that basically said, "Joseph Smith, you better have made sure that your payment's current on the newspaper subscription, or I will send a prophet mightier than thou to collect." So there was a tiff going on as early as 1841. Thomas Sharp continued to publish negative articles about the saints. In fact, at his press in Warsaw, 18 miles south of Nauvoo, he published other people's articles and books. Joseph Jackson's, here's William Harris's Mormonism Portrayed. And later in life, Thomas Sharp admitted that he would ghostwrite for some of these people who wanted to do books, ghostwrite sections and chapters. So you might say, well, didn't the martyrdom just happen on a whim? And like I said before, no, it was years of tensions. In Warsaw, they created in the early 1840s, the Anti-Mormon Political Party, which is just really kind of unheard of by today's standards. If we had like a political party with the church's name in it, like the put in Baptist, Presbyterian, Catholic, whatever, political party, that would really be frowned upon. But the Whigs and the Democrats were the major parties of the day, and they joined together in Hancock County because they were afraid of the political power that the church was having and gaining. As the converts came to Nauvoo, they could vote within the requirement was 6 months of residency, and then they could vote in the American elections. And so as Warsaw grew, the political power of the church grew, and the church members, and like many religious groups of the day, they would block vote. And so they would control the elections both locally and had potential in the state and possibly even national, depending on how national elections went. So the locals, we call them the old settlers, formed the anti-Mormon political party to try to outvote or have some control in local politics. Later on, some of the same people, some of the same leaders in Warsaw developed what we call the Warsaw Legislature, what they called that. And they would have open meetings, and they would rail against the church policy of the church leaders, and plot how to get rid of the saints, how to steal their property. They watched what happened in Missouri and saw the saints' property, millions of dollars being stolen from them. And they actually plotted and talked about getting rid of Joseph Smith. There was a time even that when they decided that they couldn't kidnap him, and maybe it was time to start talking about killing Joseph Smith in public meetings. And of course, we know that Missouri tried to kidnap Joseph Smith as well. They sent a sheriff over, and that wasn't successful. So we have to look at the main causes of strife between the old settlers and the members of the church, the leadership specifically of the church. And there were three main reasons. Political, I think in our day, we don't quite give the emphasis of the political struggle and the power, and that when Joseph Smith in 1844 declared for the presidency, that was really the match that lit things on fire. But there were also economic for the locals. Now the saints were really glad that they had their prophet running for president, and their church leaders as their local leaders in government, because they could trust them where they couldn't trust them, say in Missouri and before. So political is a big reason of strife with the old settlers or the locals, and economic. Communities often traded amongst themselves. And Thomas Sharp noted in his newspaper that in Warsaw, there were no goods made in Nauvoo. And then, of course, he put in a jab. He says, we're probably better off because of that. But there was definitely some strains. Thomas Sharp, through marriage, inherited kind of a ferry between Warsaw and Churchville, or what's called just north of Alexandria, Missouri. So he had his ferry, and then up the river, later on, Dan Jones and others had the Maid of Iowa, and so they competed that way too. But there was lots of economic competition, Dan Jones being a member of the church. But the religious, we emphasize that a lot, and it certainly played a role in it. Thomas Sharp, I have a quote here. In 1844, this is the year of the martyrdom, Thomas Sharp writes in his newspaper, "The reasons why the Mormons and the anti-Mormons cannot live together is this: the Mormons are governed by their religious leaders. The religious leaders are also their civil magistrates and control the actions of and voices of the people with a despotic sway." That didn't set well with the locals, but again, if you remember the church, you were glad to have leaders that you could trust after bad experiences before. So again, 1844, the boiling point. This is a month before the martyrdom, actually less than a month. Thomas Sharp wrote in May 29th, 1844, right in the newspaper for the whole world to see. And by the way, his articles would often be picked up by other newspapers throughout the country. And they didn't have the AP Wire or CNN. They had what was called exchange newspapers, where they would trade stories back and forth. So you could read some of Thomas Sharp's writings in New York or, Virginia or wherever you lived. The newspapers would trade stories back and forth. But Thomas Sharp wrote this: "We would not be surprised to hear of Joseph Smith's death by violent means in a short time." Now, Joseph Smith was a presidential candidate at that time. If your local newspaper wrote something about an active major party, the national figure that's running for president, if they wrote that today, the Secret Service would probably come and shut down the press, arrest or at least question the editor of the newspaper, and maybe arrest the writer. This is a threat against the presidential candidate in 1844. So what really led to the mob descending, or the mob descending, the regiments descending on Carthage, was this. We know that June 10th, after some debate, the city council of Nauvoo ordered the destruction of the Expositor newspaper, and the sheriff, the marshal, went out and destroyed the newspaper. Well, the next day, one of the owners of the newspaper, Charles Foster, came to Warsaw with a letter that Thomas Sharp wrote, printed the day after that, which was June 12th. Charles Foster came with this letter, and what Thomas Sharp printed was this: "Mr. Sharp, I hasten to inform you of the unparalleled outrages perpetrated on our property and our rights by a ruthless, lawless, ruffian band of Mormon mobocrats under the direction of the unprincipled wretch Joe Smith." Right underneath it, Thomas Sharp makes a call to everybody who reads this. He says, "We only have time to state that this is sufficient. War and extermination is inevitable. Citizens, arise, one and all. Can you stand by and suffer such infernal devils to rob men of their property and rights without avenging them? We have no time for comment. Let every man make his own. Let it be made with powder and ball." And if you look at this quote here, certain words are capitalized. That's the way it was actually published, capitalized with exclamation points and things. So Thomas Sharp is saying, hey, something bad happened in Nauvoo. The printing press was destroyed. And he makes a call for people to come together and use their gun, powder and ball. That's shooting people. And that is June 12th, about 15 days before the martyrdom. The next slide. So that morning of June 27th, as I mentioned, the mob gathered in Warsaw, and then they came up to Golden's Point. What happened earlier that day, June 27th, Hyrum and Joseph are in the Carthage jail, as well as others like Willard Richards, John Taylor, and others. And the others kind of came and went, kind of like Dan Jones was there overnight, received the last prophecy of Joseph Smith, June 26, 1844. Phenomenal prophecy. Joseph Smith certainly had prophetic gifts, and it was demonstrated then. But that morning, the 27th, Governor Ford had left and went to Nauvoo with some troops, and he basically scolded the members of the church in Nauvoo while Joseph and Hyrum and others were in Carthage jail. Well, the mob came up that morning and met at Golden's Point somewhere around lunchtime. And they met and they were deciding, they first thought maybe there was a rumor that Governor Ford was taken hostage, and they thought maybe they'd go up and rescue him in Nauvoo. And then there's other people that thought that, well, should we go back? Should we go to Nauvoo? Should we go to Carthage? They debated for a while, including Thomas Sharp kind of led the discussion. The governor heard that they were in Golden's Point here and sent a messenger to the mob and told them to disperse. And about half of them did go back to Warsaw, including, and this will be an important name, the Hayes, Charles Hay. I'll reference his son in a few minutes. But Charles Hay was the doctor for the troops, and he went back to Warsaw. About the time that they were talking, one of the guards, Frank Worrell, sent a note. He was at the Carthage jail. He sent a note to the mob. He says, now's the time to do the deed. And that was, again, the impetus for the mob. They blackened their face with powder, gunpowder and mud, different colors, and stormed the jail. So again, this is just a recap. Frank Worrell said, now's the time to do the deed. About 5 p.m., they descended on Carthage jail and they murdered Joseph and Hyrum. That night, they met back at the Warsaw House. Each town had at least one main hotel. We had the Nauvoo House in Nauvoo. In Carthage, it was called the Hamilton House. In Warsaw, it was called the Warsaw House or the Fleming Tavern. This is a building. This building sits on where the Warsaw House once stood. And what happened that night is that Anne Fleming came and her husband Sam and Anne Fleming ran the Warsaw House. It was also called the the Fleming Tavern. And the mob returned and started bragging about what they had done. Anne cooked in the back, and their niece Eliza served. Eliza Graham was probably the most important young woman in the history of the Nauvoo period, and as far as church goes, and nobody knows about her. She was 18 years old. She was a member of the church. She was working for her aunt and uncle, and she served the mob that night when they came back from Carthage. And they bragged about what they had done, and she took notes. 2 days later in the Warsaw Signal, they gave a first-hand account that Joseph Smith was killed. He fell out the window, and he fell heavily to the ground. And then July 10th, in the newspaper, Thomas Sharps admit that the community had killed Joseph and Hyrum. And I think we're going to stop right here, and Craig has some insights to the next slide here, and as well as others. And what I want to say there is that it was well known who was in the mob. 130 men were listed by the sheriff. 9 were charged, 5 stood trial. We'll stop there and come to the trial in just a minute. Craig?
Okay, well, let me introduce myself. I'm Craig Dunn. Me and my wife spent 7 years of our life living in Nauvoo. I was back there as a missionary. I was back there treating the missionaries as a doctor, their health doctor. And while I was there, I was conscripted into, I guess I can say, running the Joseph Smith Martyrdom Trail for 6 years. So this was a trail that involved a bus tour and also a walking tour, part of it, where we would go across the prairie and basically tell the entire martyrdom story. That was a great job, Brian. You brought back memories of the tour back there. But I also, after I was finished, I wrote a book called Like a Lamb to the Slaughter, which is currently in print. But what I want to mention, this is perfect for me to break right in. Oh, there, Brian has a copy of it. I'm glad you're reading that, Brian. This first slide here is the title page of the oldest book written on the martyrdom. It was written, you can see it down at the bottom, it was written in 1882 by Lyman Littlefield, who was a personal friend and acquaintance of the prophet Joseph Smith. And Brian had mentioned Eliza Graham as one of the witnesses at the trial. Well, Mr. Littlefield in his book actually interviewed one of the other men that was a witness at the trial, and his name was William Daniels. And I'm going to turn to a page in the book. I have the book here with me. And I'm going to just read this. This is on page 71. It says, and this is Mr. Littlefield now speaking, "The whereabouts of Mr. Daniels has been unknown to the writer since 1846. It is not at all unlikely that some of the parties implicated in the tragedy at Carthage assassinated him for exposing them at the trial. They swore they would do so and were hunting him for the previous several months, previous to the exodus of the saints leaving Nauvoo. On the steamboat Ocean Wave, a party of them tried to get some information as to where Daniels might be found from, and also laid a cunning plan to entrap the writer, so Mr. Littlefield as well, when the boat should land at Warsaw, for the part took in the publication of his testimony. So he actually had his testimony published first before he ever went to trial. Now, something else that's interesting about William Daniels is he was a mob member. He was inside the mob itself. Now, he was conscripted into the mob as a young 17-year-old young man who happened to be in Warsaw and needed some money. He was actually from Augusta, which is a town further east in Hancock County. And what's so interesting about this story is when he found out what he was being involved in, he actually went with the mob, and he said himself in another page in the book that he was going to try and alert the prisoners in the jail if he had a chance, or even Governor Ford, who he didn't know was how involved he was in it. He was going to somehow try and save these men's lives. And they wouldn't give him a weapon. He was too young. You really couldn't carry a weapon in the military until you're 18 years old. So he didn't have a weapon, but he went along with them. And then this is where he told the entire story of what actually he saw and happened at the jail. And it was in the jail yard when all this occurred. And he went back and reported that to Mr. Littlefield. Well, make a long story short, before the trial occurred in 1845, Mr. Daniels joined the church. So this is a mob member that joined the church, who was there with the mob. And then I want to read you just a quick piece, again, another piece in the book in the story here. So I have to carefully open this book up because it's extremely, extremely old. But anyway, I'm going to start right up here. Let's see if I can find this here. Okay, so I'm going to start kind of where Joseph is falling out the window, because that's where he saw things. He says he seemed to fall easy. He struck partly on his right shoulder and back, his neck and head reaching the ground a little before his feet. He rolled instantly on his face. From this position, he was taken by a young man who sprang to him from the other side of the fence, who it appeared had a pewter fife in his hand, was barefoot and bareheaded, having on no coat, with his pants rolled above his sleeves and shirt sleeves above his elbows. He then set President Smith against the south side of the well curb that was situated just a few feet from the jail. Then he goes on to say, once President Smith had been set against the curb and began to recover from the effects of the fall, Colonel Williams, this would be Levi Williams now, Colonel Williams ordered 4 men to shoot him. Accordingly, 4 men took an easterly direction about 8 to 10 feet from the curb, Colonel Williams standing partly at their rear, and made ready to execute the order. The fire was simultaneous. A slight cringe of the body was all the indication of pain that he betrayed when the ball struck him. He then fell on his face near his shoulder, or near on his shoulder. One ball then entered the back part of his body. This is the ball that many claim have supposed struck him about the same time he was in the window. But that is incorrect. I was close enough by him, and I know he was not hit with the ball until after he was seated at the well curb. His death was instantaneous and tranquil. So I'm reading right out of a book that was produced, 38 years after the martyrdom. Mr. Littlefield went on to become a bishop and so forth in Salt Lake City. So this is his book that he wrote. Let's go on to the next slide there.
Hey, Craig, let me make a point here then.
Yeah.
Joseph Smith was not killed inside the jail.
That's correct. And that's what I'm going to get to at the end. That's the whole point. Okay. And for years, of course, we know that Willard Richards came to the jail window and looked out. He says that himself. But what I think, and this is now my opinion, I think that what he was seeing was after he was put up against the well curb, I don't think he stayed in the window for several minutes watching what happened. We know he had to go back in, and he only had so much time to take Brother Taylor and escort him into a different room, right? So I think it was the few seconds he thought Joseph Smith, of course, laying there, thought he was dead, but he did not. I don't think he was there to witness the actual firing squad at the bottom of the jail. So this picture right here was a picture, one of many, and this is the only one that's in this particular book, but there's several other pictures. And I think this is interesting because you have to remember there were no photographs there. And so the way they would get a professional drawer to draw these pictures, and that's what they would put in books. So if you look at this, you can see the four men there representing the four men at the jail that did the firing. You can see them all lined up there in a row. You can see Joseph Smith laying against the well curb there. And what makes this picture so amazing is if you go back and look at the history, you can see the tiny little summer kitchen out to the right-hand side. So that would have been exactly correct for 1844 because they didn't start putting those kitchens back up right against the jail or right against the building, even if it was just a home, until the 1850s later on. So if you look at some of the old pictures of the jail, you'll see that house or that little summer kitchen now pushed up against the wall, and it's still there today. That's what they actually bring the tours in first through there, and then through the door that they've made in the side of the jail. But that door wasn't there in the 1840s. So that's why I think this is a very credible picture. Again, you can see Daniel's four-man shooter at in front of the well there. So let's go now to the next one. Okay, this is very interesting because now I'm going to take you clear up to 1896. So this was a lot of years later now, 1896. So about 14 years or so after the Martyrdom book came out. But I've got to explain to you something first. In 2005, there was a symposium at the Library of Congress. And each couple of years, they would do kind of a special symposium on either a founding father. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson were two of them. John Adams was another one. And then once they got done with that, they started to do, this started clear back in 1776 at the 200th anniversary of the country. But then right after the turn of the century.
1976.
Or what did I say?
1776.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they were celebrating those 70s, the 200 years. But anyway, in 2005, they started, in that decade there, they started doing famous people they thought made a great impression upon the westward movement of the country. And of course, 2005 was the 200th birthday of Joseph Smith. And so they decided to do a symposium on the prophet Joseph Smith. And it was co-sponsored by Brigham Young University. There were several major famous people there, both critics and non-critics. Dallin Oaks was one of the key people there because you remember he had written one of the main books on the martyrdom that's still on the shelves today, The Carthage Conspiracy. He was also dean of the law school in Chicago for several years there. So he was one of the main speakers, but they also had critics there as well. Well, whenever you open a symposium up like that, the first thing you're going to have is tons of researchers out there looking for everything they can find on the prophet, more than we've ever had before in history. And this actually this symposium became the impetus of what would become the Joseph Smith Papers Project, which was started just a few years after that. And it's still in process today. Well, in all of that research, guess what they found? This was found in Hamilton, Ohio, the history of historical sketches of famous people in Hamilton, Ohio. So what I want to do is just read a little piece here. And I'm going to pull this up on my phone because it's a little tough to read here. But I'm just going to read a short piece. It says, let's see here. The culminating, this is on page 184 that I'm showing you here, 184, 185. The culminating folly of the Mormons occurred in the early spring of 1844 when the prophet Joe Smith announced himself as a candidate for president. The government was denounced as corrupt, and the Mormons asserted that the government was to be conducted by this Joe Smith as the servant of God. In May, so this would have been the month before, in May, a secret national call was made for men in the adjoining states to come forward and expel the Mormons. At this time, John C. Elliott, and I mentioned his name, Brian actually found his headstone in the back of Warsaw on area 6 of the cemetery. Is that right, Brian?
Yes, yes.
So at this time, John C. Elliott of Hamilton, Ohio, was a deputy United States Marshal. A deputy United States Marshal, bold, courageous, and brave, a man perfectly devoid of fear, he was summoned to Nauvoo. Before taking his departure for the seat of war, he repaired to the residence of a William Stephenson, a noted axe maker residing near Butler County. It's in a place called Bontoit Street. It's hard to pronounce. Now West Hamilton, and borrowed a rifle that had been especially made for him by the famous gunsmith Jacob Ninemeyer of Trenton. He immediately left for Nauvoo. Now, it says here, after his arrival, Joe and Hyrum Smith, the members of the Nauvoo City Council, had been committed to jail for the charge of treason. The jail was he goes on to describe what the jail cell looks like. And then he says, the Smiths were confined in the cells, but were finally transferred to the large room. So he seems to know a lot of detail here. Governor Ford ordered a guard placed around the jail for protection of the prisoners. The Carthage Greys, a military 100 strong, was stationed in the courthouse square for the purpose of repelling the attack of the jail and the prisoners confined therein. Boy, he sure seems to know a lot for somebody that hasn't been in Nauvoo very long, right? The conspirators, who numbered 200 brave and determined men, communicated with the Carthage Greys, and it was arranged that the jail guard should have their guns charged with blank cartridges. We know that's true from the trial. And fire at the attacking party as it neared the jail. For his cool and daring bravery, John C. Elliott was selected as one of the advance assailants. Now remember, this is an undercover deputy marshal. The attacking party came up and scaled the picket fence around the jail, were fired upon by the guard, which was immediately overpowered, and the assailants entered the jail. The jail door was then battered down, burst open. Joe Smith shot 3 of his assailants. At this time, a number of shots were fired into the room, and here he says, and John Taylor and Hyrum Smith were instantly killed. So obviously, he doesn't wait to read the end of the story about John Taylor. Joe Smith attempted to escape by jumping from the second-story window and fell against the well curb of an old-fashioned well. The fall, now this is the part I want you to know. Here's another witness. The fall seemed to stun him, and he was unable to rise. While later in that sitting position, the conspirators dispatched him with 4 balls through the body. The rifle that John C. Elliott said he carried run 44 to the pound, which was the largest bore in the attacking party. Upon examination of Smith's body, it was found that he, John Elliott, had fired the fatal shot. So, what do we see here as similar to what Mr. Daniels was saying? Any similarities? And remember, this is a person that didn't know Mr. Daniels, probably. Maybe they had said hello to each other. But now he's already moved clear back to Ohio, and this is decades later, and he's now the deputy marshal of the town, and even admitting what he had done here, that he'd played this part. Okay, now I'm going to read to you. You say, well, that's great. That's a one witness. Well, what about one more? This is even amazing. This was found in a newspaper in Avery County, North Carolina. And you can still go get the newspaper article and look it up on the internet. But here it is. I'm going to read it to you, okay? And if I could have got that to you earlier, Shannon, I would have put the actual newspaper article up there. But it's by a man by the name of James Belton. This is a name we haven't heard of before. James Belton, a member of the Warsaw Rifle Company under Captain Jacob C. Davis, left Illinois shortly after the murder of Joseph Smith and made his home in Mount Avery, North Carolina. In 1898, when he was near death, Belton called a Methodist pastor to his bedside. There is something I want to tell you, something I've had on my conscience for a long time, he said. I am going to die, and I want to make a full confession before I pass on. Significantly, Belton presents the identical scenario as put forward by Elliott and Cohn. Isn't that interesting? Okay, so here he says, Belton admitted that he had 3 other men murder Joseph Smith in Carthage jail besides himself. So there's the 4 shooters at the well again. About a dozen men met in Carthage the night before, he said, and pledged that they would neither eat nor sleep till Smith was dead. They had planned to murder Smith in jail, but somehow the man escaped by jumping through the window. The blow had stunned him so he lay on the ground until 4 men, including Belton, ran around to where he was. Once in position, the men shot the prophet, propped up against the well curb. Does that sound familiar? So the same story from 2 different people, states away, 4 decades later, the information we find in a newspaper and in a historical sketches book from Butler County, Ohio. Now, to me, that just, and it sure makes Daniels, he had been discredited for so many years because of some of the flamboyant way at court he told the story. But it sure looks like today that there's a lot of information, evidence stacking up to back up his story, doesn't it? Here's something else that I forgot to tell you about William Daniels. He was offered $2,500 to not go to trial. Do you know how much $2,500 is today? I looked it up. $87,900 today, today's money. So people say, well, gosh, he's just trying to make money off of a book. You don't make $89,000 and certainly not $2,500 off of a book. It would have taken years if even he ever reached that goal.
In Hancock County, in early America, yeah.
Wouldn't it have been easier just to take the $2,500 and say, I'm out of here and I'm out of town and I'm going back to Augusta. I'm going to buy 10 farms with a beautiful land, tons of land. It would have been easy, but guess what? He didn't. He was like that Miss Graham. He showed up and told his story. And I think that's why in 1846, somehow he disappeared, right? So anyway, I'd like to tell you one other thing too. I don't think Ford was very smart, Thomas Ford. And I'll tell you why, because when he writes his history, he seems to convict himself, right? Without realizing he's doing it. So guess what? I'm going to even say that, the story of the 4 shooters wasn't lost even in our church history, because B.H. Roberts produced his black volumes of history of the church just after the 1900s, turn of the century. He says there's just too much of Daniel's story in here, so I'm going to just take it all out. And he just took it all out, okay? So from that time forward, nobody was worried about the 4 shooters because they were not in the church history books. But guess what? I found out that they are. So if you turn in, let's go ahead and turn to that next picture. Oh, by the way, this is a pamphlet of mine that was, it's dated, if you turn on the back of it, it's dated August of 1972. So this was the pamphlet that was out at the visitor center. And if you look in it, it's extraordinarily detailed, and there's drawings in there of what occurred across the prairie. It was great for me to use as a tour guide. But guess what's missing? The 4 shooters at the well. Okay, so I'm going to go on to the next slide there, Shannon. Let's see, go on to the one, we might have these out of order. Go on to the one that has page 31. Yeah, here it is. Okay, and you can read this yourself. Read there right at the bottom. This is taken right out of Governor Ford's history. He wrote a history before he died. And right at the very last paragraph, look what he says here. So evidently he was well informed about what exactly happened at the jail too. Joe Smith now attempted to escape by jumping out the 2nd-story window. But the fall so stunned him that he was unable to rise. And being placed in a seated posture by the conspirators below, they dispatched him with 4 balls shot through his body. Thus fell Joe Smith, the most successful imposter in modern times. That's right in our own history book. So now we have the 4 men at the jail, the shooters here, right? So this is from Tom Ford himself. That's in our church history books. And now, last of all, let's go on to this last one. This really, I know that Justin in his film talks about Willard Richards and makes a great picture of Willard shooting Joseph before he jumps in the back, before he jumps out the window. Well, I don't know how, I think he needs to read books a little more often, because this is right out of church history book 2, volume 7 verses page 616 says, 5 p.m. Jailer Stigall returned to the jail and said that Stephen Markham had been surrounded by a mob who had driven him out of Carthage, and he had gone to Nauvoo. So we know that fits the story. Jailer Stigall suggested that they would be safer in the cell. He obviously was thinking something wasn't going to be good. All these people had left Joseph during the day and never came back. So he says Stigall suggested they would be safer in the cell. Now, I don't know if you've been there or not, but the dungeon cell is very dark. There's no windows to jump out of. There's tiny little windows for air. And the door that entered that room was all barred. It's not today, of course, because we take tours in there. And this is what goes on with the conversation. Mr. Stigall went out, and Joseph said, Dr. Richards, if we go into the cell, will you go in with us? Do you think he would have gone in if he knew that he had to stay out and be the shooter? You're in sitting duck in there. You can stand at that door and see in the entire room. Anybody who would have had a gun stick between the bars could have killed all 4 prisoners. Sitting ducks, no escape windows. Yeah, okay, so Dr. Richards, if we go into the cell, will you go in with us? The doctor answered, Brother Joseph, you didn't ask me to come across the river with you. You didn't ask me to come to Carthage. You did not ask me to come to jail with you. And do you think I would forsake you now? But I will tell you what I will do. If you are condemned to be hung for treason, I will be hung in your stead, and you shall go free. Joseph said, you cannot. The doctor replied, I will. Does that sound like somebody who really wants to set himself up and kill himself, be killed himself as well? You only kill someone else when you want to survive and take their place, right? So this should answer, Justin, this should, you should be alerted to this. And I guarantee you, Dr. Richards had other opportunities. He was his personal secretary for 2 years. Never left Joseph's sight. So here's the thing I want to say. So three main points here. Number one, as Brian said, I think we can pretty much know now the new story is Joseph the fatal shots weren't fired inside the jailer's bedroom. They were fired outside the jail. That's number one. Number two, the conspiracy to kill Joseph Smith, for which that was the actual charge at the trial, extended way beyond the borders of Hancock County. Remember, don't forget, he was running for president of the United States, and he held the voting block for the 9 electoral votes in Illinois. So even if he wasn't going to be president, he was going to decide who was, because that's how tight the race turned out to be. And then finally, number 3, fair testimony. Joseph Smith died for a couple of reasons only, and we know that it's in scriptures, and we can maybe talk about a little bit about that later. But Willard Richards did not shoot Joseph Smith. He didn't shoot him in the room, and he surely wouldn't have volunteered to go into the jail cell if that was his plan. So that's my short moment of presentation.
Thank you, Craig. Appreciate you doing that. Now we're going to turn the time over to Kimberly Smith, who's
Now
going
let me continue here just a little bit, Shannon, and say let's talk a little bit about the trial before we go to Kimberly, because it's really interesting to follow up with Craig, because the people that stood trial never once said, hey, you know, we were there, but we got there and the Mormons killed them, you know, killed their leaders, and they should stand trial. Never once in their life did they ever say that the John Taylor and Willard Richards should be hung or should stand trial. So here's what happened at the trial. The grand jury, they looked it up to, they were going to indict up to 60 people that they knew that were in the mob, that were part of the crime, but they ended up indicting 9, and 5 stood trial. Court week happened. You know, they didn't have a ongoing courts sessions. They would have a traveling court, and it would come to Hancock County twice a year. So they were hearing other cases. When this case came up, again, the People versus Levi Williams, it wasn't the People versus John Taylor or Willard Richards, because everybody knew that John Taylor and Willard Richards weren't part of this. It was the Colonel Levi Williams, who Craig mentioned. But the charge was conspiracy to commit murder, because that was an easier charge to get a guilty verdict on, because it was clearly easy to identify who stirred up, who was the soul of the movement, as the prosecutor Lambert said in his opening statements. So there was a sitting jury here hearing other cases. Yeah, there was only, here's one thing we need to remember, is that this was in Carthage, and this was in 1845, and it was very hostile toward members of the church. The mob and their friends came to Carthage to court week. There was hundreds and hundreds of people who were supporters of the mob. When our church leaders, Brigham Young and others, found out what was going on, they said, Joseph and Hyrum weren't safe in Carthage. Let's keep our members here in Nauvoo. And so no church members went, except a couple, including Eliza Graham, who was actually brought in the last couple, she wasn't planning on going to testify, but she was convinced just a couple days before. And she was actually snuck into the courthouse past some armed mob people that were kind of guarding around Carthage. There was about reportedly 1,000 people that surrounded the town of Carthage to keep any members of the church from coming to testify. She got in, Daniels was there. When the trial started, the prosecuting attorney went to Judge Young and said, the defense attorneys went to Judge Young and said, we need a new jury. And they said, what do you mean? And he said, well, the sitting jury right now is tainted, and so we want to select new people. And the judges, who? And they said, people in the audience. Well, who were in the audience? It was the friends of the mob. And there was an open carry situation. There were people with guns inside and outside the courthouse, and it was quite a hostile environment. And the judge amazingly allowed the jury to be dismissed, and they picked 9 random people from the audience to be the jury. Well, they started, and what the star witness was Eliza Graham. She was just 19 now. And the night of the martyrdom, as she served the mob, she remembered who said where they said what they said and how they said it. And so at the trial, she again explained what she saw, who said where, what they said, and how they said it. And it was an impeccable memory. And, Jacob Davis, William Grover, we're all bragging. Thomas Sharp said we've finished off the leading men of the Mormon church, quote unquote.
Yeah, Brian, she knew too much.
She knew too much. And that's what her testimony was discounted because she remembered too much. All 5 were acquitted. Sharp was the first one to publish about the trial. Never once did he say, you know what, we escaped by the skin of our teeth. I hope that the law goes after the real murderers, Willard Richards and John Taylor. Nobody ever fingered Willard Richards and John Taylor that were involved in the trial, that were there at Carthage at the time. As you mentioned, Dallin Oaks and Marvin Hill's Carthage Conspiracy book, very good research. Later on in life, somebody asked Thomas Sharp, well, did you kill Joseph Smith? And he said, well, the jury said not. And Sharp again went on to serve 3 terms as mayor of Warsaw, and he's buried 1 mile north of Carthage. So I mentioned Charles Hay, Dr. Hay, who was the doctor for the Warsaw troops that went back to Warsaw. Well, his son was just young at the time, but he grew up to be Warsaw's most famous son, famous product, however you want to say it. He became President Lincoln's Secretary of State, and he was an ambassador to several countries for several presidents, and he negotiated the Panama Canal Treaty for one. So if you ever go through the Panama Canal, it was partially there because of Warsaw resident John Hay. Well, as he became famous and well known throughout the United States, he wrote an article that was a community memoir. Again, he was kind of young at the time. He wrote it for Atlantic Monthly, and he recounted the events of Carthage and specifically the jury. And this is what he wrote for the National Magazine. There was not a man on the jury, in the court, in the county that did not know the defendants had not done the murder, but it was not proven, and the verdict of not guilty was right in the law. And again, he didn't say, well, they ought to look at John Taylor and Willard Richards or other people, that weren't, that didn't stand trial. Everybody knew that they'd done it. 2 more things, really. Tensions exploded after the murders of Joseph and Hyrum. Orrin Porter Rockwell kills the guard Frank Worrell, who had sent the note over. Thomas Sharp immediately prints revenge. They started burning Mormon property, and then the Battle of Nauvoo, after the Saints had started to leave the Exodus we're familiar with. The Quincy Whig in September 1845 said the Mormons must leave peaceably if possible, but leave they must. The Carthage and Warsaw both had conventions, and in February 1846, the first wave of the Saints left. Now, this is important because if Brigham Young, if John Taylor, if Willard Richards had conspired, as this Justin Griffin movie would maybe lead us to believe, or other people have suggested that it was an inside job, that Brigham Young was part of this conspiracy to take over the church. The events that happened afterwards are not the type of events that 2 opposing parties in collaboration would experience. Did the local mob conspire with Brigham Young to kill Joseph Smith? They sure didn't act that way. Brigham Young didn't come out and say, you know what, why are you kicking us out of Hancock County? Why are you burning our farms? We got together and killed Joseph Smith, don't you remember? He never said that. And likewise, the local mobs didn't say, Brigham Young, why are you kind of, we could get the government involved. Brigham Young tried to get the state to calm the mob down, and sheriff and militias deputizing former members of the Nauvoo Legion to go to Warsaw. And never did the locals say, hey, we had a deal with Brigham Young to kill Joseph Smith. Why the tension? The facts speak loud and clear of what happened before, during, and after. And anybody who wants to look at the historical record could see that it was not an inside job. It was the mob from Warsaw that came and did the murders. And they said that they did it. They said that they were going to do it. They said they did it, and they went to their graves saying that they did it. And they never said anybody else was involved. especially members of the church like John Taylor and Willard Richards. And so the movie Who Killed Joseph Smith, in my opinion, is just not credible. And the history is, we can have faith in what we've been taught and what the history books show, all come together to support the narrative that the mob from Warsaw killed Joseph and Hyrum. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Appreciate you doing that. Now we're going to turn time over to Kimberly, and she's going to talk about the activities and people that are involved with the conspiracy there in Nauvoo.
Great. Thanks. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can everyone see that? Okay.
Yet.
Yep. Okay.
Well,
So
first, we cannot see your screen yet.
Oh, you can't?
No. Go ahead and share it.
Oh, I did. It's weird.
Again.
Okay. Hold on.
We can see you, but on your screen.
Oh, okay.
Hit the green button. And then, yeah.
There we go.
There you
go. Okay. Is that good?
Excellent. Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay. So, and I likewise want to point out that the docudrama Who Killed Joseph Smith is based on a modern conspiracy theory. And because it's based on a conspiracy theory, I want to point out that there is not one single irrefutable, objective, or historical fact that they can show to demonstrate that their modern conspiracy is true beyond all reasonable refutation. So from a historical perspective, the biggest problem with Justin Griffin's theory is that there's no direct evidence, like witness testimony or a confession, to support it. And most of the modern day advocates of the inside job conspiracy are members of groups bearing such names as the Doctrine of Christ, the Denver Snuffer Movement, or in some cases, the RLDS Church and other offshoot groups that call themselves the Remnant. And all of the advocates of the inside job theory reject the ordained leadership of Brigham Young and priesthood succession in the church to President Nelson. And I thought that was important to point out just because we can see that they do have an agenda, and they are trying to, they ignore any evidence that contradicts their preferred position. So, but on the other hand, the historical record does show that there was a conspiracy to kill Joseph Smith, and there was a conspiracy by friends who were in league with members of the mob in Missouri, with Governor Ford, and with Thomas Sharp. So what I want to talk about is what happened in the 6 months leading to Carthage. So Nauvoo, like Kirtland and Missouri, became a refiner's fire. It was like a sifting from the chaff from the wheat. It was a time of revealing if the spirit of motivation was with the individual, was solidly for Jesus Christ and for the building of Zion, or if it was for something else. And with the founding of Nauvoo, a new group of men named John C. Bennett, William Law, Wilson Law, William Marks, Robert Foster, and some others became leading members of the church. So essentially, they replaced the other apostates, the Whitmers, Oliver Cowdery, Thomas B. Marsh. And however, after 1843, these same men opposed the prophet Joseph Smith and attempted to advance their own religious designs. So essentially, the martyrdom of the prophet Joseph Smith was brought about in a significant way through the writings and the actions of these men who had become apostates and sought the destruction of the prophet Joseph Smith. And I just have to try to move something here because I can't see my screen. Go back. Okay. So in the winter of 1843, there were constant efforts in Nauvoo. I can't see my screen. Hold on. There were constant efforts in Nauvoo by the prophet's enemies in Missouri to capture him and to drag him back to Missouri, where he could be murdered with impunity. And so as a result, the prophet Joseph Smith appointed 40 night guards to patrol the city. And these night guards came in contact several times with the conspirators who were moving through the city suspiciously in the darkness. William Marks, president of the Nauvoo stake, complained of the appointment of the night guards at a city council meeting, to which Joseph Smith replied quote, "We have a Judas in our midst." And this remark from the prophet gave great offense to William Marks and to both of the Law brothers. And the prophet Joseph Smith, because their reaction was so great, he actually published his response in the Millennial Star, and he said, "What can be the matter with these men? Is it that President Law and Marks are absolutely traitors to the church? That my remarks would produce such excitement in their minds, that the traitor whom Porter Rockwell reports to me as being in correspondence with my Missouri enemies is one of my quorum." And we know he's talking about William Law there, because at the time, William Law was a member of his first presidency. And William Marks afterwards was prominent among those who induced Joseph Smith and Hyrum to deliver themselves to their enemies in Carthage after they started west to save their lives. And this is going to be an important detail that we're going to see later on.
Kimberly, I'm not sure if everybody realizes that William Marks did not follow Brigham Young west. He went with James Strang up to Voorhees, Wisconsin.
Yep, that's correct. So these are the final events leading up to Carthage, at least in Nauvoo, among the conspirators, or among Joseph Smith's friends who were also plotting his death. So on August 12th, 1843, Hyrum Smith introduces the doctrine of celestial marriage to the Nauvoo High Council. 6 months before the martyrdom, the citizens of Nauvoo, Illinois, nominated Joseph as a candidate for presidency of the United States. And political enemies of Joseph Smith feared his influence and the power of Nauvoo's city government and militia.
And Kimberly, I'll just make a quick comment if that's
Yeah.
okay. The day before, Saturday night, or I mean that Wednesday night would have been before the Thursday martyrdom. There was actually in the Hamilton Hotel at a private meeting, 23. This is comes from Stephen Markham, who was a personal bodyguard of the prophet. 23 delegates from the 26 states in there talking to Governor Ford. My, don't I find that interesting, how you can find that many political leaders from all these states in a little town on the western frontier while a man running for president is 2 blocks away in a jail.
Right. Thank you for including that detail. That's very important. I'm gonna bring that up later too.
I'm sorry, I didn't know that was part of
Oh no, actually, I didn't include as much detail as you did, but we will see that that's very significant. We also know that William Law, a former member of the first presidency at this time, became bitter over the introduction of plural marriage and was excommunicated from the church on April 18th, 1844. And then on just 3 days later, on April 21st, 1844, William Law held a public meeting where he denounced Joseph as a fallen prophet, and he organized his new church. And then this becomes very significant because on May 15th, 1844, the Warsaw Signal, as we heard from Brian, it's a paper antagonistic to Joseph Smith and the Saints. They published a statement in support of William Law's new church, and they announced that the non-Mormons in Nauvoo and William Law are said to, quote, be strongly in favor of repealing the Nauvoo Charter, which we know that the Nauvoo Charter protected the Saints from the same kind of violence and harassments that they had experienced at the hands of the Missouri officials. But now their enemies and former friends were calling for its repeal. And that also becomes a very important detail in understanding why Joseph had to specifically go to Carthage. So in the spring of 1844, Joseph Smith was then alerted by 2 young men named Dennison L. Harris and Robert Scott of a secret movement to take both his life and the lives of several other leading men in the church, including Hyrum Smith. So these 2 young men attended 2 meetings of spies, and before going to the 3rd meeting, the prophet told them that this would be their last meeting and that their blood might be shed, but if so, they were to die like martyrs. But by divine intervention, their lives were spared, and they brought to Joseph a report of what they had witnessed, including a recounting of the requirement that everyone present at the meeting take an oath to be willing to take the life of Joseph Smith. And this is the oath that they swore before God. So when they went on to administer the oath to those present, each man was required to come to the table and hold up a Bible in his right hand. Then Brother Higby would say, "Are you ready?" And when the men being sworn in answered yes, he would say, "You solemnly swear before God and all holy angels, and these your brethren, by whom you are surrounded, that you will give your life, your liberty, your influence, your all for the destruction of Joseph Smith and his party, so help you God." And each one was sworn that way, numbering in the neighborhood of 200 persons. So if you can imagine the hostility that was going on in Nauvoo at this time, because not only do you have the Missouri mob trying to come into Nauvoo to take Joseph Smith to kill him, you have his political rivals, you have the governor of Illinois, but now you have church members, including one of Joseph's own members of his first presidency. And interestingly enough, Joseph Smith actually gave a discourse on the conspiracies on Nauvoo. So he was very much aware of what William Law was doing. And he said in 1844, in his discourse titled Conspiracies on Nauvoo, he says, "I have been informed by two gentlemen that a conspiracy is got up in this place for the purpose of taking the life of President Joseph Smith, his family, and all the Smith family, and the heads of the church." And then he names the conspirators. He says the names of the person revealed are as follows: Chauncey L. Higby, Dr. Robert D. Foster, Mr. Joseph H. Jackson, William and Wilson Law. And in his testimony against the conspirators, he said, "All the lies that are now hatched up against me are of the devil, and the influence of the devil and his servants will be used against the kingdom of God." So Joseph Smith is prophesying of his death. He goes on to say that men are here today who are seeking my blood, and they are those who have held the priesthood and have received their washings and anointings, men who have received their endowments. And I just can't imagine the heartbreak that he must have felt, knowing that those closest to him were seeking to take his life. And notice how he never once names Willard Richards or John Taylor.
Or Brigham.
And then he testified that William Law had offered Jackson $500 to kill him. So Joseph Smith was very much aware of who was plotting to take his life. And then we know that on June 7th, 1844, the first and only issue of the Nauvoo Expositor was published that vilified Joseph Smith and again attacked the Nauvoo Charter. And Joseph Smith and the city council were very concerned at this threat because it was a threat to their liberties and their lives. And so they met, and according to their understanding, they decided that the Expositor was, by their own charter, a public nuisance, and that they had the authority not only to confiscate it, but to destroy the press. And on June 10th, Francis Higby, who was a member of one of the conspirators, he threatened the saints while the city council was in session and said if they lay their hands upon it, meaning the printing press, or break it, they may date their downfall from that very hour, and in 10 days there will not be a Mormon left in Nauvoo. So I just think this speaks to not only their anger, but that they had murder in their heart, and they would stop at nothing to destroy Joseph Smith. And a witness recalled that Brother Joseph called a meeting at his house and told us that he had an open vision in daylight that he said that if they did not destroy the printing press, that it would cause the blood of the saints to flow in the streets, and by this was that evil destroyed. So I know I wanted to include that because I've seen modern scholars kind of they criticize Joseph Smith for this action, that perhaps if he had not called for the destruction of the printing press, that he would not have been killed. But at this very act, he had saved the lives of the saints. And when they returned to the city council to report that they had destroyed the printing press, Joseph Smith recorded, "I told them that they had done right and that not a hair of their heads should be hurt for it." But of course, he didn't tell them that he would lose his life over it. So now we're heading to Carthage. On June 12th, 1844, Joseph Smith and members of the city council were charged with committing riot during the destruction of the Nauvoo printing press. However, on the charge of riot, Joseph and the city council were tried and they were acquitted by the Justice of the Peace, Daniel H. Wells. And Thomas Ford, the governor of Illinois, pronounced himself unsatisfied with those legal procedures and insisted that the prophet go to be tried in the very hotbed of the cruelest opposition in the state, which was Carthage. And Thomas Ford even later wrote in a letter that one of the reasons he sent Joseph Smith to Carthage was to, quote, placate the masses. And as I've studied Carthage, and I can't really go into it too much here, it's not really the premise for this podcast, but there is a direct parallel between the death of Jesus Christ and Joseph Smith. And so you start to see these parallels where, like Jesus Christ, he went before Herod and Pilate, and they knew he was innocent. But in order to also placate the masses, they sent him to his death. And that's essentially what Thomas Ford did here. Joseph was found innocent of the riot, and instead Thomas Ford, he sends him to Carthage knowing that he was sending him to his death. And then on June 20th, 1844, Joseph forwarded to President John Tyler in Washington, D.C., the affidavits that spelled out the threats that he was receiving of the uttered extermination from both Missouri and Illinois. And he appealed to the President of the United States to render the protection that was guaranteed under the Constitution, but nothing was done in response. And then on June 23rd, 1844, Joseph and Hyrum decided to save their own lives and crossed the Mississippi to avoid arrest. And unfortunately, this is when William Marks and other members of the church demanded that he return and called him a coward. And this is when he uttered his famous phrase that he was going like a lamb to the slaughter. And if his life was of no value to his friends, it was no value to him. On June 24th, 1844, Joseph and others left Nauvoo for Carthage, Illinois to stand trial. And so again, we're going to kind of talk about why Carthage. And I'm glad that it was brought up about the caucus and the delegates that had convened in Carthage specifically to talk about killing Joseph Smith. And so that's why Carthage becomes so important. Why Carthage? Carthage was the headquarters for the caucus who had threatened to destroy the Smith family. And the caucus also included Joseph H. Jackson, Mike Barnes, Captain Singleton, and a Missourian who boasted of his murder of men, women, and children in Missouri. And so going back to...
Right here, if you don't mind if I just mention something here. So you remember this is the night before Martyrdom when the delegates were meeting, and Stephen Markham just happened to interrupt their meeting.
Yes.
And that's where one of the men by the name of Southwick from Texas grabbed the minute book, and Markham saw him do it and wouldn't let him out of the room till he could read some of the pages. By then everybody had scattered to the other rooms in the hotel. And that's where he got the information. And you're probably going to talk about, maybe you'll talk about that, about what was actually read in the minute book.
I don't think I will, but if you want to do that now, or do you want to wait?
I just thought I just mentioned that says that if he doesn't get into the presidential chair, I'm not quoting word for word, but if he doesn't get into the presidential chair this time, he probably will be next time. And if we don't kill him, he may become president, and then the Missourians are going to have to cough up all the money for the stolen property. And that was that was kind of the meeting, just of the meeting.
Right. That's an important detail. I had forgotten to put that in, But thanks for bringing that up. Yes. And I think it's interesting that, like, as we're talking, there's multiple witness statements of those that were seeking to kill Joseph Smith. So, in Carthage on June 24th, we have Cyrus H. Willock, who was told by Johnny Hicks that it was determined to shed the blood of Joseph Smith by not only himself, but by the Laws, Higbees, Fosters, Joseph H. Jackson, and many others, whether he, Joseph Smith, was cleared by the law or not. So while he was sent to Carthage under the guise of this arrest, it didn't matter because they were going to kill him regardless of what happened. And on June 25th, 1844, Joseph and Hyrum are paraded by Governor Ford in front of the troops that has assembled, and they were then given bonds for appearance at court, were arrested on the charge of treason, and committed to jail without examination. And I also wanted to point out that Captain Dan Jones, he overheard the leaders of the mob say that they did not expect to prove anything against him, but they had 18 accusations against him, and that as one failed, they would try another to detain him there. Dan Jones told them to desist from their cruel persecutions, to which Jackson replied that they had worked too hard to get old Joe to Carthage to let him get out alive, and pointing to his pistols said, "The balls are in there and they will decide the case." And just in conclusion, I did want to read this statement. It's Joseph Smith's prophecy about his murderers. And I want to read this prophecy because it's one of the reasons that I believe that in order for Justin Griffin to advance his false narrative of an inside job, he had to ignore all of the events leading up to Carthage. The truth of who killed Joseph Smith is in the historical record. And it was not a coup d'etat. It was a well-planned and successfully executed assassination of both a religious leader and a political candidate. The prophet Joseph Smith left multiple witness testimony of who his murderers were and who were involved. And so 2 days before his martyrdom, several of the officers of the militia were curious to see the prophet, and they visited Joseph Smith in the room and Joseph Smith asked them if there was anything in his appearance that indicated that he was the desperate character his enemies presented him to be, and he asked them to give him their honest opinion on the subject, and the reply was, "No, sir, your appearance would indicate the very contrary, General Smith, but we cannot see what is in your heart, neither can we tell what are your intentions." And to which Joseph Smith replied, "Very true, gentlemen, you cannot see what is in my heart, and you are therefore unable to judge me or my intentions, but I can see what is in your hearts, and I will tell you what I see. I can see that you thirst for blood, and nothing but my blood will satisfy you. It is not for crime of any description that I and my brethren are thus continually persecuted and harassed by our enemies, but there are other motives, and some of them I have expressed, so far as relates to myself, and inasmuch as you and the people thirst for blood, I prophesy in the name of the Lord that you shall witness scenes of blood and sorrow to your entire satisfaction. Your souls shall be perfectly satiated with blood, and many of you who are now present shall have an opportunity to face the cannon's mouth from sources you think not of, and those people that desire this great evil upon me and my brethren shall be filled with regret and sorrow because of the scenes of desolation and distress that awaits them. They shall seek for peace and shall not be able to find it. Gentlemen, you will find what I have told you to be true." And I personally believe that Joseph Smith is a prophet. And if he's prophesying and he can see the hearts and the intents of these men, but he couldn't see the hearts and the intents of John Taylor and Willard Richards, I don't think so.
Thank you, Kimberly. I think it's very apparent here that it's very important for us to realize why Justin Griffith wanted to not examine the historical documentation, because within examining the historical documentation is all the proof that it was not a conspiracy John Taylor and Wildridge conceived by Brigham Young, but that it was by those who stated that they did it, and they were doing it. And they were what the friends that they talked about were within the church, and they were identified in his specificity, in his calling them out. So it is important that the historical records be understood and be brought into this conversation, because they proved beyond any reasonable doubt that those who killed Joseph Smith were not John Taylor and Willard Richard. Brian, you have something you'd like to say?
Yeah, that last little part where Joseph prophesies that those men in that room will be, some will see a cannon from whatever, what was it, the source from you know not what. If we explore that, that was a remarkable prophecy, because some of these leaders went on, I believe it was in Texas, if I'm not mistaken.
Battle of Buena Vista.
Yeah, tell us about it, Craig.
It was in 1840.
Yeah.
1847, just briefly, I think it was the 3rd Regiment of Illinois, which would included Hancock County. In 1847, they were fighting, of course, the Mexican army. They were caught in a box canyon and realized they couldn't escape through there. So they came back out of the box canyon, and their own men shot them with their own cannons, thinking they were the enemy. So they were killed by what we call today, I guess, friendly fire. But it didn't turn out to be so friendly, because about 75% of the entire regiment was wiped out by their own cannon fire. So Joseph Smith not only predicted that would happen, but right down, he said they would face the cannon's mouth from a place they knew not. And the place that they knew not was, unfortunately, their own men.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. So at this time, we're going to segue over into an examination of a forensic examination of what that should look like. And we will be hearing from Jim Tracy and Sam Weston as to how you should conduct a forensic examination, what are the 101 attributes of that, as well as to show some documentation and some video evidence of the lack of that type of an examination of some of the events that Justin portrays in his movie. Okay, at this time, let's go ahead and turn it over to Jim Tracy, who is going to talk to us a little bit about the forensic side of this project.
Thank you, Shannon. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today and be part of this panel. I'd like to go over some of my qualifications first, just so there's an understanding of my background. I just finished 41 years of law enforcement experience. I have been an investigator for many years in the sheriff's office. I also served for 5 years as part of the Utah State Medical Examiner's Office investigator, as a field investigator, and have conducted over 500 death investigations. As part of my law enforcement experience, I also was an armorer, a range instructor, and firearms enthusiast. I have a large collection of firearms, including many black powder type of weapons that I shoot and have shot for many years. So I have a fairly extensive background in looking at different wounds, different types of characterization of the type of damage that firearms do, both modern and historical in the black powder era. And so I'd like to kind of address some of the forensic issues when it comes to the video Who Killed Joseph Smith by Justin. I think there's an issue that we need to discuss. I really looked at Justin's video as more of a docudrama. When you compare it to what should have been included in an investigation that is a true forensic investigation, well, it doesn't add up. I think there were too many instances where there was an injection of things that might have been possible, but have no reference to any historical writings or history, witness statements, and the existing evidence that we can look at forensically that still exists, the clothing, the door holes, and some of those things that are still here when there was a representation of some kind of reincarnation of that event. There was not enough care taken to compare apples to apples in their recreations. So I really look at his video, which is well done as far as the videography and the different slides and things that he puts in there. They're very well done, but on a forensic level, they are not accurate. So what's a forensic investigation? Let's look at this screen right now. I'll kind of read over this. That might give us some background as to what we should or shouldn't have in an investigation that's a forensic nature. It says here that the definition of a forensic investigation, an investigation that involves the application of scientific principles of knowledge, methodology, proofing of actual direct or indirect evidence through existing technologies. Of course, technologies have changed over the years, and that we have much better technology than we did even 10 years ago. It also talks about an analytical evaluation of events or discovered material items of evidence retrospectively, which is what we would do here, to make a determination or finding concerning the relevance of said evidence or materials to an investigation of an incident that occurred in the past. That's exactly what we're doing here. A forensic investigation must be an examination of actual direct or indirect physical evidence, statements, and must exclude speculation or the injection of hypothetical or non-extant materials or information. At times, a forensic investigation or examination will produce a scientifically definitive conclusion or a finding. At other times, a conclusion or finding will only be found to be within the measure of some realm of possibility, scientific possibility, eliminating the much larger field of all things that might be possible. So pertaining to the forensic investigation that we're talking about today, the martyrdom of Joseph Smith and Hyrum Smith at the Carthage jail in 1844, we will limit our forensic investigation to existing physical evidence, personal witness statements, court records, historical reports, and exacting recreations of any ballistic testing that might be needed. What we would not include and should not include will be specifically additional items of a speculative nature or things that are not recorded historically in any timeline or motive. And I think that's the area that I end up having the most problematic issues with in Justin's video.
Yeah, I
For
think.
example, Jim-
Go ahead,
Oh.
Kim.
Yes.
For example, Jim, because you're talking about in a forensic investigation that we're not to include non-existent materials or information. And I think it's important to point out that Justin invents two guns. They're not historically documented in that jail in order to make his theory work. Is that correct?
Right. I think we have a quick screen here of just the two guns. Let's go to the two guns first, Shannon.
The two guns. Okay,
Yes, the picture of the two guns.
let me do that real quick.
Okay. Yeah, historically, here we have a picture of the two type of guns that were written about that we know were inside that jail room. There's a 6-shot pepper box, what they call a pepper box pistol, and then a single shot, basically a single shot Coke pistol, what they call them, and they're both black powder. But those two, not only do we know that they existed, because even after the fact, they were reviewed, and the pepper box was found to have still 3 unfired chambers, and the other single shot, which was Hyrum's pistol, had not been shot either. It was still loaded. And not only do we know where these or that these pistols were there, we knew where they came from, who furnished them, and how they got into the jail. In Justin's recreation, at one point, there are 3 different pistols that are produced, or 2 pistols, and one had to have been reloaded. That was the depiction of Willard Richards, which we'll get into in a minute. But those are not recorded historically anywhere. And to just create them, to manufacture them, you're basically putting a bubble over that room. And this is where I think Justin just goes off the rails. He's trying to account for every wound that is historically noted, and he uses the historical records on these wounds when it's convenient and ignores the other historical evidence outside the room when it's not convenient. So he's trying to account for every wound, but he's trying to do so with a bubble over that room that includes no shots or firearms being shot into the room, only, quote, within the room. And to do that, he has to invent at least 2 different weapons. And in my opinion, it would have to have been 3 weapons, 2 for Willard Richards, because he would not have had time to reload a weapon and then fire and hit Joseph Smith twice, which is depicted in Justin's video. So maybe we oh, go ahead, Kimberly.
Just quickly wanted to point out, I thought it was interesting that you said, so historically we know that these 2 guns were examined and we know that Hyrum's gun was never shot. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So that right there in his movie, he has to show, he shows Hyrum's gun being shot, which is
correct.
contrary to evidence.
Right. So that does not match up with any of the evidence that was examined, i.e. that gun, or the historical account that was written about the gun, that it was still loaded. So maybe we could go to some of, and there's another introduction of just fact, statements of fact that are considered to be fact by a narrator in part of what we'll review here in a second, that is not contained anywhere within historical written record, or fits any of the timeline from all the other records and historical records that are written about what people did outside the jail and within the jail immediately after the shooting. So maybe we could go to that, Shannon, and just look. And this, before we start this, you see right here in this picture, if it had extended a little more to the left of the door, you would see that all 4 of these actors actually have a pistol. So in this picture, we have at least 2 pistols, one for Willard Richards and one for John Taylor in his hand, but it's not really shown in this video, but it will be in a second, where they are holding pistols that are not recorded anywhere in history. We do have the 2 accurately portrayed pistols, the single shot that's in the hand of Hyrum, and then the little 6-shot pepper box in Joseph's hand. Let's go ahead and run this video.
Okay, tell me when to pause it.
I will. Okay, here's the 2 shots to the door.
Wayfaring man, if hath often crossed me on my way, so humbly for relief that I could never someday.
Let's stop it right there, Shannon, just for a second. Okay, this video depicts Joseph going out onto the landing by himself and shooting at this point after the 2 shots had come through the door. Well, if you know anything about that landing, it is so small that if there are people there with rifles or even just pistols, they're trying to shoot through that door and attempting to get into that room, where would Joseph be going? He'd be standing right up against them.
He'd be bumping right into him. He would be toe to toe.
They would be face to face. And so that's an inaccurate representation of what could have even happened there. Let's go ahead and continue the video. And now we see, we see Willard, here we see John Taylor now with the pepper box that is not recorded anywhere. Okay, let's stop right there. Okay, just prior to that, just a half a second before that, we see that Willard Richards is now yelling some kind of warning to, I guess, Hyrum, which causes Hyrum to turn around. Now, if Willard Richards was involved in this right there, why would he yell a warning to Hyrum if he was part of this and knew that this was going to happen this way? So it causes Hyrum to turn around, and now this quote struggle ensues. Let's go ahead and play it. Okay, let's stop it there. So Hyrum has just shot John Taylor into the in his right leg in the depiction here, but we know that all of the wounds in John Taylor's body were on the left side. But it shows that Hyrum shot his single shot into John Taylor's leg. But we know from historical fact and record that his pistol was found unfired at the end of this event. Let's go ahead and continue. All right, stop right there. Here we have a depiction of an all but contact wound with the firing of the pepper box into the lower portion of Hyrum's right jaw, underneath his jaw, which supposedly in his depiction creates the entrance wound into his neck and the exit wound out the left side of his nose. Just for context, a contact shot that close with a black powder pistol, with all the smoke, the pressure, and the burning powder that follows the bullet out of the barrel, would have done a massive amount of wound to the flesh and even up into the face, as the pressure of that shot follows up the bullet, behind the bullet, and into the soft tissues of the face. So we see none of that in the death mask that we have of Hyrum after the fact.
There would be a severe amount of black powder charring on the face and also on the clothing around there.
Yeah, let's say that maybe that pistol was moved a little further away from his neck and down more towards his chest. There would be even substantial charring of the black powder that's burning outside the barrel, especially in that short of a barrel, all over his vest and his shirt, and then all over his skin, what we called pseudo stippling. Okay, let's continue. Now Joseph Smith comes in after all this is done. So he's been standing out on this flat outside the door on the staircase, face to face with these people for 4 or 5 seconds, which is just not historically accurate, nor would it be feasible with these guys trying to shoot at Joseph at this point in time for him to stand there without ever having received a wound.
It's more like 15 to 20 seconds he was out there.
Well, yeah, it's video time, but let's continue.
Still open great
Okay, now here we have the first in the video where it's John Taylor delivering a wound to Joseph Smith from his pistol that is not recorded anywhere historically. Okay, let's continue.
I think it's important to note here that both John Taylor and Joseph Smith are shooting 6-shot pepper box pistols.
That's right. So both of these weapons supposedly are around the 30-32 caliber size because of the nature of that type of a gun. Okay, let's stop it right there then. So now supposedly we have all the wounds have been delivered to John Taylor. And in the historical record, the doctor who removed the ball from John Taylor's hand afterwards, when he pulled that ball out, he said it was about a ½ ounce in size. Now, a pepper box 32 caliber ball is nowhere near the size of a ½ ounce, probably closer a quarter to a third, where something of the 50 caliber size would be about a ½ ounce in weight as far as the ball is concerned. So that's an inaccurate depiction there, and a recreation that does not produce the same type of wound as is shown in this video.
Yeah, and also when they show him getting shot in the hand, they show it being directly right in the palm of the hand, where it actually was in the arm and traveled up to the hand.
That's correct. It was more of a low angle shot, not a high angle shot like it shows into the hand. It would have traveled up the arm bone or into the wrist and then into the hand. It was a low angle shot, which we know historically is accurate from the description of the doctor who took that ball out.
That's what the wounds actually show. So.
Okay.
Once to me was clear as day, was now obscure, read from my heart. How could these brothers I betray? Loyal to this line.
And here we show Willard Richards shooting his first shot into Joseph Smith, a gun that's recorded nowhere in history or historical writings. Okay, let's continue.
That's a single shot.
That's a single shot pistol. Okay, let's stop it right there. So now we have Willard Richards producing a second single shot. He either had to, within just seconds, reload the first pistol he had, which is not possible, or he's producing a second pistol, which shows 3 pistols now in this narrative that are not recorded anywhere in history. We only have the first 2, which was the pepper box that was in possession of Joseph Smith and the single shot that Hyrum had. Now we've had the introduction of a third pistol that is not recorded historically anywhere, with this second pistol that Willard Richards is about to shoot Joseph Smith with. Let's continue. Now, we ought to listen to what the narrator says here. This is the part I want to have the narrator's voice very well established so that we can hear the injection of the narrator's, quote, statement of facts.
Willard Richards tries to make the room look like the mob committed the murders. He collects the guns and fires more shots into the wall and possibly Hyrum's leg.
Okay, let's stop it there. That statement is recorded nowhere in history or any of the writings from any of the witnesses. And secondly, it's historically impossible based on the timeline. Willard Richards then reloaded the guns and shot additional shots into the wall to make it look like the mob had done it, to reload all those guns because they're all empty now. If you count the shots that are possible from all of those weapons, they're all now empty. When Willard Richards quotes, picks them up to clean up the room. So you'd have to sit and reload those. And those are all black powder ball and cap, or ball and flint. So you have to have the materials to do that. First off, you'd have to have the ball, you'd have to have the wadding, and you'd have to have the powder. And then you'd have to have the time to ram all that down and to preload the either cap or to pre-charge the flint pistol with its flash powder.
Yeah, what he's
Where
showing
did all this time?
Yeah,
What's
and what
that?
he's showing there is 8 shots that he had to reload. 8 shots.
Well, yeah, if he's going to add additional shots into the walls to make it look like where did this timeline come from? I mean, it just does not reflect any timeline in reality. And again, people that came up the stairs almost immediately afterwards, when did Willard drag John Taylor out into the other part of the jail to hide him, with all this other time that he's reloading? Where in any historical writings does it ever say Well, as we were going up the stairs, we shot a couple of shots through the door, and all of a sudden there was all kinds of gunfire inside the room. And when we went in, everybody was dead but Willard Richards and John Taylor. And so we just left. I mean, even in the trial of those who were accused of these murders, they easily could have had, and I'm sure they would have used any kind of evidence or excuse to say, we didn't do this. Yeah, we were going to go there to do this. All of a sudden, something erupted inside the room and the deed was done, and we just left. At no time was any reference to this given by anybody who was tried or through any of their memoirs in their diaries or historical writings. So as it is just rife with issues that really is a contortionist act to try to put this bubble on, explain all the wounds as they would have come from some kind of possible event inside the room without any exterior or outside the room influence on the firearms. So and I know there's other recreations that have been done as far as the forensics of how these wounds would have been by Justin, where they do not have accurate representations in the recreations. As using a 12 gauge shotgun instead of a black powder for some of them, the angles he's shooting straight into skulls instead of the angle like Hyrum's wounds that show an angle from the throat up and then out. So we do know from some of the testing that Sam Weston has done, he's done quite a bit of it, that much of this just could not have happened and is not feasibly linked up to the existing evidence we do have from the clothing that Hyrum was wearing, the door and the holes in the door. So it really is an inaccurate and non-forensic reconstruction of the event that Justin has made.
So I'd like to ask a question back into these pistols. So
Okay.
these are the pistols that would have to have been reloaded. And let's say he did 6-shot pepper box in 2 of these pistols. What's the most, I mean, if you are an expert and you have the perfect condition, you're sitting at the table to reload these, how long would it take to reload these pistols?
Well, the single shot down below has its ramrod. You'll see the ramrod in the tip there that you pull out to help. So you would have to either take a powder horn or a pre-made charge, paper charge. You'd have to rip the powder charge, pour the black powder in, then take the ball wrapped in either a paper type of wadding or a cloth wadding, set it up on top of the barrel, take the ramrod, shove it all the way down, pack it with 2 or 3 strikes to make sure it's seated. And then you'd have to half cock the hammer and put a cap on that. And now you're ready to go. If you're really quick at that and it's all right there ready to go, you've got it in your pocket by your vest with the pre-loaded round, probably 20 to 30 seconds. If it's not a pre-loaded round and you're doing it from a powder horn, maybe 45 seconds to a minute.
Okay. So that's a minute to 2 minutes. And
Right.
then to reload these 6 shots.
That would take considerable more time. As you notice now, there is no ramrod with that pistol. The ramrod is not part of the pistol carried with the pistol. You'd have to find your ramrod in your pocket or somewhere, wherever it's sitting on a table. And then you'd have to pour powder into 6 different barrel chambers that are in that shot, 6-shot. Then you'd also have to seat 6 bullets with their wadding and ram down 6 bullets. And then you'd have to recap up at the top part where you're showing the hammer. You'd have to recap all 6 of those chambers with a new cap.
Yeah,
and
so
that is very tedious because there's a very small hole there you can see where you have to use your finger and push each cap as you rotate it all around 6 times before
yeah,
you
so
could
it's
actually
even more than
fire
that. You have to recap it, you have to partially pull this back, which releases the hold on the
Right.
barrel. Then
Free
you have to
spin
take the caps off that are there, put new
Right.
caps on, and do that 6 times.
Yeah.
So we're talking about 5 minutes more. So there was not that much time during that the mob was willing to sit out there and wait and say, hey, we're kind of waiting for this thing to get reloaded.
Yeah.
So you've got a problem with this whole
None of the timelines reflect any reality from any of the written witness statements about what some of the people did right immediately after the shooting when they saw that Joseph had gone out the window and they ran downstairs. You know, while they're sitting down there and they're shooting Joseph at the well, they hear all these other shots going off upstairs. Go, what that's going on? What's that up there? It just doesn't reflect reality.
Do you want me to continue?
Richards helps Taylor into the next room, where he leaves him for the next 9 hours.
Is that all you wanted to show on
Yeah,
this?
that's all there. So like again, so he shows him moving John Taylor into the room after supposedly the narrator says, you know, that he reloaded and basically shot more bullet holes into the wall to make it look like the mob did it. So I just think there is just so much here that is not an apple to apple recreation. Some of his recreations, like I said, are not done with the proper caliber. They're done with modern weapons of different caliber. He said he just matched velocities. I tried to match velocities to show bullet wounds, and that is not something that is the only criteria. It's far from the only criteria of what you're trying to match. A 12 gauge shotgun is 75 caliber, and we know that the largest weapon that could have been used was a 69 caliber. So, and a modern day slug from a shotgun is made up of lead, but also antimony and tin to make it much harder than what would be a pure lead ball projectile from the 1800s. So as they move through either materials like the door or through flesh, because of the hardness difference, because of the what we call the ballistic coefficient of the shape of them, they will both move in different type of manner and trajectory.
What else would you like to discuss here?
Unless Kimberly has a question, I think maybe it'd be time to turn it over to Sam to look at much of his recreations and what he has done and try to be exact in his creations, apples to apples on many of these shots.
So before we go into Sam, I want to show, I was given permission to have access to the skeletal remains, photographs of the skeletal remains of Joseph and Hyrum. And there's some facts that are brought out, and you can see with those photographs of the state of those skulls that kind of help establish what could be happening to each of the individuals and what could not be happening. So let me share my screen at this time, and I will. So this picture here is when they finally uncovered the remains in the basement of the what they call the B house or the outhouse. You see there's a more intact skull here. This brick is important because the floor was actually covered with brick as a base, and that was on top of the skulls. And this one here shows the less intact skull. So one skull was more intact than the other, and the other was dramatically different in its presentation. So this is the more intact skull, and they actually, when they first examined the skulls, they claimed this to be Hyrum because they saw this break here in the side of his face. But if you realize that this is the right side, Hyrum was shot or had the deficiency here in his fleshy part. So that is, they inaccurately identified this skull. And now,
Shannon,
yes.
I just wanted to point out, when exactly did they identify these skulls? It was my understanding it was in 1928. Is that correct?
Yes, correct. It was in the early 1920s, 28. And it was, what happened is the RLDS Church was concerned about the grave sites being washed away by the Mississippi River because they had dammed up the Mississippi there at Keokuk, and the water started encroaching on the Smith property there, which there's a bunch of graves that are there of the family. They're farther up, and then there's Anna's grave, and then they knew that the brothers had been buried in a secret location, but they didn't know exactly where it was, and they actually ended up spending almost a week trying to find that. And they actually came across it when they went down to Emma's grave, and they started cutting across that. They actually, where her grave was not supposed to be, they found her. It was quite a few feet below her gravestone. And then as they kept going more south towards the river, they then discovered the skulls in this building. It wasn't, the building was there no more. What they did is they found a foundation, they found the brick, and then they uncovered that and they found these remains. So as you can see here, this is both right side and front profile. And the jaw that you see here is not really in the right position at this time. That's how they had it in the photograph. You have to actually move it up. We have some doctors later on help us move it into the right position. We get on to the next. Now, this is the less intact skull. As you see, there's a tremendous amount of deficit in the skull here in the upper part of the face. And then this jaw is not in the right position, but they positioned it to take a picture of it. And let me get the other picture of this. This is the front and right exposure of that. You really see all the delicate bones that make up the sinal cavity in the front of the face are missing here. Now, most of those would have been actually in the dirt, but since people that were doing the excavation were not archaeologists, either they did not find them or they just did not put them as part of the pictures. But if they still would have been there. The reason why we say that, and this is the less intact skull, as we go through and look at it, and this is the more intact skull. It shows that all these bones and the nasal cavities were in place. So this skull definitely did not have a bullet shot, one or two in the head. It just did not do that. So this is the rear of the skulls. They show for content and size, a pocket watch and a ruler. And then you have those in perspective there. These is the doctors that we had come in and helped us reconstruct the anatomy and then also talk to us about what they saw there. And both of them said that the less intact skull had no shots to the head, absolutely none. And the more intact skull definitely showed that there could have been one or two shots to the head, because it shows that disruption of the bones. And what happens when you have a shot to the skull, you have the bullet that goes in there, and you also have the pressure of the bullet going through there that actually kind of disrupts the
Well,
skull.
Shannon,
yes,
there's an additional thing. There's the thing called hydrostatic shock.
right.
As the bullet pushes through that material that is the soft palate, the nasal area construction of the cartilage, and that all of that has fluids in it and is of a nature that will take any kind of energy and propel it through itself and onward in what they call hydrostatic shock. And even though it didn't tear it apart outside the face, within the face, it would have ruptured and cracked a lot of that would result in that type of damage shown in that skull, where it has been basically fallen away as it decomposed because of that trauma that was in that face.
Well, there's even documented evidence about that it did happen. So later on, they buried the bodies in the foundation of the Nauvoo house, which was going to be a hotel in the office of the church. Later on, Emma was concerned that as they continued to build the Nauvoo house out, that her husband would be buried in the basement. So she had the same people that helped her move the bodies and bury them in the basement, move them over to a different location, which was on property. And when they did that, they brought the caskets over to the mansion house. They opened them up. They took hair samples from each, and Emma was able to say one last goodbye to her husband. And then, interestingly enough, is Hyrum's wife was not invited to this, so she was upset forever about not being invited to this. But as they examined him, they documented that the front of his face had fallen into his skull, and that it had fallen in. And that was another, like you say, evidence of what would happen when the body starts to decompose, that all these fine connections that had been ruptured were then now capable of just falling into the head.
So Shannon, why didn't it show that on the face mask? The
death mask? Well, at that point, that point, the fleshy tissues were still intact on the inside. They hadn't decomposed. So the bones were being, held in place by whatever was left of them from that. And I know that they stuffed the wounds with cotton soaked in camphor to help make it look more natural. And you see that cotton ball coming out of Hyrum's face on his death mask, which is on the left side. So this is the more intact skull, and it shows that all these, the skull is not made of just one bone; it's made up of lots of bones, or interconnected with fissures, and specifically around the nasal cavity. There, a lot of those bones come together. You have, the jaw bones down here. You have these bones here that connect, and so when you take a look at that, and let me go to another picture. This is the picture of the shirt that would have had stippling and fire or evidence of a close proximity shot to the face and the body. There is none of that on this, and there is also none of that on the vest. So it would be right here around the collar. They say that they cut out some pieces to get rid of the blood, but there is enough of the collar there that would have shown right in the area that shot would have been taken that is missing, and it's not there. So, this is just, again, more evidence that what they are saying happened to Hyrum with the two, the one shot underneath with John Taylor shooting. It just has no evidence that it happened. Okay. Any other questions that we have before we turn it over to Sam?
I don't.
So I just want to make it clear here. What you're saying is that less intact skull, you were successfully able to show that belonged to Hyrum.
Yes, in fact, both the members of the community Christ that used to be the restored or the RLDS, they all agreed with me. In fact, I was a little nervous to come back, and they'd given me permission to use the skulls photographs, and now I have to come back and say, hey, you guys made a mistake when you did the examination. And I had to point that out to them, because we had to positively identify the skulls that they were Joseph and Hyrum before we could actually utilize them in our project. And so in doing so, we discovered who was actually who when it comes to the skulls. And when I mentioned that to them, they said, well, we already suspected that. Thank you for doing that. It helps clarify some concerns that we had that they had been misidentified. And so they didn't have any problem with that. And interestingly enough, the people who had a problem with it was members of our church, and actually gave me a really hard time about trying to reinvent history. And a lot of people just didn't listen to what we said. They thought that I was telling them that the death mask had been misidentified. And we did not say that. We clearly just said that the skulls had been misidentified. So.
Well, thank you. Wow, that's really incredible. That actually shows direct evidence that he was shot in the head.
Very good use of forensics.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and interesting enough, we're just taking a very light cursory evaluation of what was actually done by Justin, and we plan on going back and doing a much more in-depth reconstruction of these things, actually using the correct forensic approach, and that will, we'll have to come back and do that. It's very expensive, and you have to take a lot of time to do it.
In closing, though, I would just say that I watched the video and stopped it, Justin's video, and made comments and notes on where there are inaccuracies or where there are forensic recreations that are not apple to apple type of comparisons. And I have about 8 pages of notes.
Right. So one thing that Justin has said over and over again is nobody has come forward or been willing to examine his approach and debunk it. Well, we're doing that in a very cursory way, and we don't have to take very long to do that. It's very quickly that it does not reflect either the scientific evidence that is there, nor the historical written documentation that's there.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jim. That was a great presentation. And we'll now turn
You're welcome.
over to Sam and his presentation. Okay, at this time, we're going to move over into our forensics discussion with Sam Weston. So Sam, why don't you go ahead and start us off here?
Okay, thank you. Well, just give you a little background how I got started on this forensic stuff. Is I've been a long time historian addict for the church, read and studied everything, but most of my interest in the forensic side started about 15 years ago when two brothers by the name of Joseph and David Lyon did an article in BYU Studies. They kind of did a CSI study of Carthage jail. And even though it's interesting, in my lay mind, I could see a lot of mistakes, a lot of problems, very problematic to me. And plus, the biggest thing was they discounted the eyewitness accounts, which I think is very important in studying Carthage jail and what happened. So I've started researching and doing a lot of things, trying to get answers in my mind. Was Willard wrong? Was John Taylor wrong? Or could their accounts really have happened like they said? So after several trips to Carthage jail and reading and studying and teaching myself black powder and learning it, buying guns and shooting them, I think I've come up to a pretty good conclusion of what actually happened, and it matches Willard and John Taylor's accounts without any problems whatsoever. I think I was the first one to discover what the correct size of the bullet hole in the door in Carthage jail was. It was made by a .54 caliber gun. Could have been a pistol, could have been a rifle. They were both available. In the Lyon brothers' accounts, they only talk about one weapon, a 69 caliber muzzle loading gun. And I've come up with a list of 30 plus guns that were more than likely there that day. And everybody, even if they had a long gun, a lot of them would carry pistols. Every officer in the militias, they were all expected to carry a brace of 54 caliber pistols with them. So very common gun at that time, and a very common gun at the jail. We have eyewitness accounts that say they saw muzzle loaders, they saw rifles, they saw breech loaders, they saw pistols. So we have witnesses that verify multiple guns at the attack. So John Taylor also, I verified the two holes in the door. John Taylor was shot at least 4 times. And I've identified 2 shots in the John Taylor that I believe are 54 caliber also. In Justin's video, he ignores both these shots. He doesn't really talk about them. John Taylor was shot all on the left side, the left thigh, the left lower knee, the left hip, and the left arm that went into his hand. Justin talks about that shot, but he ignores the statement from the doctor who removed the ball from his hand that it was a half-ounce ball. Half-ounce ball is roughly a 52 to 54 caliber ball. And also the first shot John Taylor received in his left thigh, when they removed that ball, John Taylor commented that it would flatten to the size of a quarter. Quarter back in 1844 is the exact same size as a quarter today. And I flattened several different caliber balls, and the closest match by far, in fact, an exact match, would be a 54 caliber ball. So I've identified at least 4 shots that were 54 caliber into that room. And so, well, let's go to that first slide there, Shannon.
So before we get going, I think Kimberly has a question she wanted to ask you about your interaction with Justin.
Okay.
Yeah, so we know that you were in the Who Killed Joseph Smith Part 1, and I was just curious if you could speak to if you feel like you were properly represented in his movie and how that came about.
To be honest, I feel like I was duped. He came up and approached me by email, and I invited him to my shop, and we discussed all of my research. I shared it with him, at least the research at that time. It's been ongoing, and I know more than I did then too. But I shared it with him, but he was asked if he could film me, but I thought it was just for his own reference material later on. He seemed sincere about wanting to really know what happened at the jail. But fast forward 6 months or so, and he produced a video that I had no idea he was doing. He didn't ask my permission to be on there. And in a lot of ways, he represented me correctly, but I think he edited it in such a way that he took a lot of pertinent information out that would probably affect his results. And I even notified that my research had been ongoing, and I found other things that I think would affect his outcome on his testing and research. But it was all agenda driven. Obviously, he wasn't really looking for any truth. He was just looking for ways to prove his own theory and his own agenda. But I was duped, and several other people were duped in the process.
So you feel he was deceitful with you?
Yeah, he wasn't upfront and honest with me at all. No.
Let me get that shut up for you.
Well, if you want to play that first slide, like I say, the 4 shots I could identify at it came from a 54 caliber gun. So the gun I used in some of my testing, not all, I used different caliber guns, but the stuff I'm going to show right now I used this 54 caliber smoothbore pistol. It was a percussion gun. So not a flintlock, but a percussion gun, still muzzle loading. This is a replica, but an exact replica. It would act the same in every way that an original gun would. In fact, it'll act better than if you found an original gun, it'd be old and probably wouldn't fire correctly anyway. So these replicas are actually better to use in testing to get the same results they would have had back in 1844. So next slide, please. So this panel I have here, I've probably shot hundreds of shots into walnut panels that are 0.80 inches thick, which is the same thickness as the door into Carthage gel. So I've measured all that in Carthage, so I know that for a fact. So this experiment I started to do here was to prove whether or not Hyrum's head was at the door. Ever since the Lions account, and probably before, anytime anybody talks about the attack, they have Hyrum with his face against the door. And Willard and John Taylor both agreed that Hyrum was 2/3 back into the room when the shot came through that panel and struck him in his face on the left side of his nose. And so this is the fixture I set up to perform this test. So next slide. So this is the back side. So you can see as the ball goes through, there's a massive amount of wood that's displaced. Now, the reason there's more chipping in one side, the other side one is a piece of black walnut, but a little bit harder wood. This all came out of the same board, but I cut and spliced it so I could do a sampling on a harder section and a softer section. Anytime you have a piece of wood, it's not consistently the same strength all the way through. It varies depending on how it's grown. So the right side, number 1, was a harder piece. The left side, number 2, was a softer piece. So doing the comparison of the wood, the door and Carthage gel is obviously a harder piece of walnut, matches closely to number 1. So next slide. This just tells the loads and the angles. So number 1 shot was a 20 grain load, and the number 2 shot was a 30 grain load. Both shot, let's see, 40 grain, 30 and 40 grain. So 40 is probably higher than would have been shot normally. That type of gun usually would shoot a 30 grain, but I just wanted to see what happened when you put more power behind it. So what was interesting, both bullets came out of the door and immediately took a different angle. They didn't come out in a straight line. They came out at a more downward angle, one more than others. And we'll see that here in the next slides. So this is a ballistic gel head, which is representative of a human skull. I don't think there's any way to exactly replicate a human skull when doing testing, but you'd probably get in trouble if you were doing original skull. So this is the closest thing we can use. So this is showing Hyrum's face against the door, kind of the angle he'd have to be to have the shot hit him in the face. Next slide. This is after the shot hit him with the left side of the nose, and you can see the amount of wood just collected right there. Next slide. So this is the head pulled back, and you can see the amount of splintering. Those splinters are actually stuck into the face. If Hyrum's head would have been there, there would have been massive damage, which would have been noticeable on the death mask. Also, in the center of that mass of wood, you can see a big burn mark on it. The powder comes through there hot, and in my testing, we'll see later on, the flame actually comes through that door if you're close enough. which would be about 2 feet away as I'm shooting these. Next slide. So this is the angle of the bullet, which is probably 20 to 30 degrees steeper than I was shooting at the time. So the bullet came in and did a downward motion. So never straight shot. Once that bullet comes through a doorway, it moves in all kinds of directions, depending on how much the ball was deformed. Next screen. Because this is the second shot. I shot it on the right side this time with a different load. And you can see there's a big chunk of wood that went right into the wound. And again, you've got splintering all over the face, a big burn mark right there in the center. That would be visible in the death mask if it would have happened, which it's not. Next slide. Okay, this pencil shows the extreme downward angle that bullet came out with. And let's see, I think it shows better in the next slide. So you can see all the burning inside the wound, and that dark area right in the middle is actually the ball that's still in the wound. But if you look beyond that, you can see the wound track of the first shot. It goes kind of horizontal and makes a downward turn. And then it exited out through the neck. That's where it actually came, the back of the neck. The first shot, the second shot did not exit the body, but it was heading in the same downward direction. Next slide. So this is what I pulled out of the wound of the second shot. That big clump of lead on the bottom is the round 54 caliber ball. That's what it looked like after going through the door panel and completely deforming. So you can see that it would not have a straight shot through anything after that point. It would wander all over inside your body or whatever you shot. That wood is actually wood that came out of the wound track also. So a lot of damage. So basically what I'm saying is that Hyrum's face was not against the door when it was shot. So we can prove the Lyon brothers' theory and several other people's theory that he was not at the door. He was back into the room when the ball hit him in the face. Next slide.
And that does corroborate John Taylor and Willard Richards' testimonies, correct?
Exactly, yeah. So here's a shot through the panel done in slow motion. You can see the wood break out and then hopefully see the flame and smoke come out also. Maybe.
Trying to get it to run here.
There we go. So obviously a tremendous amount of force with those balls coming out. But even at close range, one ball probably would have exited the neck area, but their ball didn't exit. So anybody close to that barrel blast, whether it be a shooter or the intended victim, would definitely get burn marks on them. Not only from the barrel, but from the primer end or the flintlock end, you get burns from that. People were very cautious shooting their weapons to keep that away from their face because they didn't want to get burned either. That was a common problem. If you were in close proximity, you could easily burn yourself shooting these weapons.
There'd be evidence of charring on the clothing as well, correct?
Yeah. If you're shooting into clothing, there'd be big. So here's a shot slow-mo out of the barrel of a rifle, vintage rifle, very correct. You can see the spark up at the end and then you can see the flame coming out of that gun. So if you're shooting that into clothes, a person with clothes, like Justin suggested Hyrum was shot, there'd be a huge burn pattern, probably 1 to 2 feet in diameter, possibly on the clothes, unless you were point blank. If you were 2 feet away, there could be as much as a 12-inch or bigger burn pattern left in the clothes, and there's no sign of that whatsoever.
What are the particles we see out here at the end? You see them?
Yeah. That's what you're seeing is unburned powder. In a modern gun, most of that powder burns. In a black powder gun, all the powder is not burned, so they're not as efficient. Here's just looking at the muzzle coming out. Shot coming out of the end of the muzzle.
Yeah, there we go.
So you can just imagine if that was within a few inches of your face, It'd just be burned to pieces.
It was like
And
first,
so,
secondary flames and things like that. So this is the
yeah. So that's why it's important to have a period gun with period loading techniques, is to see exactly how that powder burns or doesn't burn. And what you're seeing coming out of the gun is unburned powder for the most part, especially at the end. That last bunch coming out is unburned powder, burned after the shot. It probably burned, but after the bullet had already exited the barrel. Just the heat of the barrel will ignite it. So it's hard to check velocity. Just you can look at charts and look velocities at old guns, but that's just an average. That varied dramatically on so many different variables. So you can't just find an old chart and say, this is the velocity of this gun shot. You'd have to go back to that day and load it and check it multiple times, because you can load a gun 10 different ways on 10 different shots, depending on how much powder you got in, how tight your wad was packed, if you got the ball seated at the end of your barrel. And when you're loading under extreme conditions, you don't load exactly like you should every time. There's a lot of variables.
Well, that's really
in fact, in the Civil War, they found people shot with the ramrod. They forgot to put the ball in. They just put the powder in and put the ramrod in and shot, forgot the ball. So I'm sure the attack of the gel, if they were reloading, would be under extreme conditions.
So this really discredits the shot that they show. Was it Willie Richards or John Taylor takes Hyrum and shoots him underneath the
yeah.
Air? There's no way.
If you look at that, if you go back and watch that video portion, both the shooter and the victim being shot would have visible burn marks on them. And there's no mention of burn marks by anybody during that attack.
So you were also going to talk about some new investigations or data that has come out.
Yeah, so when I first started researching, I wanted to find other people who had researched actual wounds in vintage guns into victims. And it was just hard to find. Nobody really did studies of that. The earliest studies I could find were done mainly during the Civil War or post-Civil War era, where the guns had started to change a little bit in their manufacture and the powder changed. But one case study I found during the Civil War is somebody was shot in the face with the weapon, the round ball. It went in his skull, around the inside the skull, and came back out again, showing that a ball in a human body does not take a straight line. It goes to the point of least resistance, or I don't know how to explain exactly. I don't know the makeup of your skull and how thick and dense everything is, but it's proved, those studies proved that a ball would not make a straight line necessarily. Sometimes they would, but a lot of cases it didn't. I came across a study published just recently in the Journal of Forensic Science, and it was made by two doctors from Poland. And what intrigued me about this study was, in Poland, there's 38 million people live in Poland, but only 200,000 registered weapons, modern weapons. So very few people own a gun, use a gun, and they're rarely used in homicide cases or robberies or anything. But these two doctors study black powder weapons, because Poland has the same laws the United States has. Any weapon made prior to 1885 or a replica thereof is not controlled by any laws or regulations, and you can own them without any permits or anything like that. So those guns, while not real plentiful, are still in use in Poland today. And so what they did, a case study on multiple suicides using black powder guns. And these suicides, for the most part, were self-inflicted gunshots into the head. They had a lot of photographs and stuff that proved my point really well, but they're not really appropriate broadcast. They're pretty gory, but I'll describe them a little bit. So what they found in their tests is probably 80% of the time, the bullet shot at point blank range, whether it was in the mouth or the temple, the bullet did not exit the head. It stayed in the body. A few instances it did come out. And when it did come out, they easily were able to identify and showed pictures of this to show an entrance wound and an exit wound. they were very obvious to the naked eye. Even untrained eye can see that's an entrance wound, that's an exit wound. So the point I'm trying to make here is, in Hyrum's case, everybody that commented said Hyrum was shot twice in the head, once on the left side of the nose and once in the neck. Justin's trying to say that's all one shot, and it couldn't possibly be two shots. Well, it could very likely be two shots, and more likely is. There's no evidence of burn marks, and the men at that time who were looking at the wounds could identify as easy as I could by looking at these pictures what an exit wound and an exit wound, entrance wound and an exit wound looks like with a round ball. And so I think this is pretty good proof to show the eyewitness accounts knew what they were talking about. Everything they mentioned, I have proven without a doubt could happen. I have
What's
no
the
doubt.
distinction then between an exit and an entry? So what is the difference in the look at that?
Well, the big difference is on the entrance wound, it's a nice, round, smooth hole.
Mhm.
And it's usually a little larger than the size of the ball.
Mhm.
The exit wound, you see, I can't remember the medical term they use, but basically it's torn skin. It's flaps of skin that have opened up, let the ball go out, and then closed. And so the doctors mentioned those flaps could be closed again on an exit wound. On an entrance wound, that skin, that flesh, anything around there is just gone. There's nothing to close. So the exit wound is very identifiable by the flaps of skin that could be closed again. So
that was good.
I thought that was quite interesting. And I've been looking for a study like that, but unless you go out and shoot a whole bunch of people, it's hard to study the effects of a ball on a human body. So I'm glad I ran into that. It kind of confirmed Willard's account. And that's been my whole goal all along, is I believe that Willard, maybe he might have missed a few little details. Anybody does trying to remember what happened. But you got to remember, most people wrote their accounts down or told their accounts years after the fact. In some cases, decades after the fact, their story was told. John Taylor's account was written 10 years later. So I can imagine he'd probably forgotten some of the details. But Willard's account had to have been written within days of the attack. His job was to keep notes of everything that happened. So he had the paper, he had the writing utensils, he was familiar with sitting down. And as soon as something happened, he sat down and wrote about it so he wouldn't forget. He was an early historian and trying to keep accurate notes. So I put a lot of faith in what Willard wrote down. And I think with all my testing, this could take hours to show you everything I've done, but with all my testing I've done, I can prove that everything Willard states is plausible and could have happened just the way he said it did.
So Kathy has a couple of video clips that she'd like to play and ask you some questions about that. So Kathy, do you?
Oh, Kimberly.
Kimberly, sorry.
That's okay.
Kathy earlier. So Kimberly, would you go ahead and share your screen?
Yeah. Okay. Let's see here. Okay, I don't know which one this is, so we'll just start with this one.
Through my theory again really quickly, why I believe it was an inside job. I've admitted that I don't think I have the evidence yet to prove absolutely in court that it was an inside job, but I'll tell you why I think the evidence is saying this was done by John Taylor and Willard. The main evidence is that gunshot through the door that did not strike Hyrum. And we can prove that. And we did that with the ballistics. Both that injury would have been way far worse on Hyrum's head, and the shot through the door would have looked very different if these were the two things that actually were the kill shot. So if Hyrum wasn't shot through the door and was actually shot through the chin, which again, the ballistics and the forensic evidence proves he was shot through the chin and it exited out of the side of his nose. If that's the case, then how was that shot made? Is there any possible way that it could have been made where someone in that room took this shot and Willard and John weren't lying with their description?
So break that down.
Right.
Well,
yeah. I just wanted your response to his claim. It's a pretty bold claim there. And as you see, the intro to his video is Willard Richards' biggest lie.
Yeah, he said that Hyrum was at the door. So he's already starting off with a false premise.
Yeah, so I think I've shown you here that he's wrong. It can happen. We can shoot through a panel, hit Hyrum in the head, the ball stays. Other testing I've done also would show the same results. Modern testing shows the same results. He is using weapons that aren't period correct. He's using loads that aren't period correct. The way he sets up and shoots his objects are just, there's no science behind it whatsoever. It looks pretty impressive to watch those skulls blow up, but nothing about it is scientific whatsoever. I'm not a scientist, but I've proven that balls can enter the head and stay there, and balls going through a door can enter a head and stay there. And especially when you go through wood panel, the balls deform, change direction. His shows that going straight in and straight out, but he's using different types of
Well, I think
ammunition, different types of weapons, different types of powder. You just can't compare the two. So I think I've easily shown that he's wrong, and Willard did not lie. Willard's account stands still. I'd take him on any day, side by side forensic tests, and I know who'd come out and say, yeah, Willard's account stands.
I think whether we agree with Willard that he was not at the door when the shot happened, and we agree with Justin that he was not at the door, but we do not agree that somebody could shoot him under the neck and take that shot, because there's no evidence of that. There's no stippling, there's no gunpowder residue, there's none of that. So that shot could not happen either. So all of that he's saying, he starts a false premise that Willard says he was at the door when he got shot, and then he goes into this other
I've looked at Hyrum's clothes minutely under a microscope and everything too, and there is no sign of any burn marks whatsoever on the shirt, the vest, the pants, anything. So any shot that entered Hyrum had to have been using the black powder, at least 3 feet minimum or further away. Even at 3 feet, I think you'd get some, but depending on the gun you're using, it'd have to be at least 3 to 4 feet away, or you'd see visible evidence still of burning to the clothes.
Thank you. So why don't we just go into the next video?
Okay. And just to set this up, this one is Justin actually interviewing Gentry, who was the gentleman who performed his ballistic testing. And so I'll just let the interview speak for itself, and then you can respond.
What's your experience with black powder rifles?
Only the modern style that actually have the barrels that
that are
rifle barrels, and they don't have everything's all enclosed, so the primer and everything goes right into the back of the barrel.
Yeah.
And so nothing's exposed, nothing's open. So
Okay, so I'm just curious if you think his inexperience with the black powder rifle would affect the outcome of their experiment.
I think it very possibly could. I'm familiar with the type of guns he's talking about. I have those too, but he's saying the old guns weren't rifled. That's not true. Guns have been rifled since the 1700s. They weren't as common in the 1840s because they were expensive to make, but that really wouldn't affect a lot. That's just accuracy and long distance shots. But modern guns, the old guns, you're counting on paper wads or something to seal the end of the barrel to keep the powder and ball tight together. So when that ignites, explodes, it comes out with as much force as possible. If you load a gun, a muzzle loading gun, and if you don't get the wad and powder clear to the seat, you've lost a tremendous amount of volume. And that sometimes the ball will get stuck because if you don't seat it properly, and that was a big thing in battle. Sometimes when you're loading under duress, you wouldn't get your gun seated all the way, and they wouldn't fire, and they'd jam, and your gun was inoperative after that point. So there's, and even in an old breech loader at the time, they would leak air during the firing. A percussion gun, not as much, but a flintlock gun, which has a pan to the side that you put a little powder in, and you light that powder, and that powder flame from that powder goes through a little hole into the barrel. Well, that's an open hole into the barrel. So when that gun fires, it leaks pressure out. So you don't put as much pressure on the ball, so much force going out. The modern guns don't have any of those problems. They're all precisely measured powder. They're sealed up. If there's moisture in the air, they're not affected. In 1844, on June 27th, it had been raining. Nauvoo is notorious for being humid on a sunny day, let alone a cloudy, rainy day. Black powder at that time was started to be affected by humidity as low as 7% humidity. So if we're talking 60, 70, 80, I've been there when it's 90+% humidity. How's that going to affect the powder? People have tested it, and it drastically cuts the force of that powder down. And if your gun's already loaded and the water gets in, and there is thousands of variables you'd have to test to know exactly how everyone worked. Justin's done about 10 shots that he's shown us, all with the wrong guns, with the wrong ammunition, with the wrong props to shoot through or shoot at. Everything he's done, none of it's scientific, none of it matches what really happened that day. So to draw a conclusion from what he's done just doesn't compare at all what would have happened in 1844. So
I would say that almost any realistic forensic analysis team would throw all that out and say, no, there's not enough consistency in examining the facts and putting the right things together to do that.
Yeah, I agree.
Hey,
And I just had another question really quick, just to speak to the shot coming from the window, where he says that that's impossible to have the shot come from the window. And what would you say to that?
When I was at Carthage several times, I measured the height from the ground to the bottom of the window. I had somebody stand in the room approximately where Hyrum was said to stand, 2/3 of the way back in the room from the door. And I went outside, and at 60 feet, which is fairly close, you've got an easy shot of hitting Hyrum in the back. It'll clear the windowsill. Those windowsills are extremely low compared to modern houses anyway. And you have an easy shot at 60 feet, maybe a little closer, but I know at 60 feet, that's an easy shot. The Lyon brothers testing said that was impossible. They couldn't see anybody in the room. They couldn't even see anybody at the door, but maybe they were older than me or their eyesight was worse than me. But I was there on June 27th at 5:15 p.m. and standing at 60, 70, 80 feet away, you could easily see people in the room. You could see the door. It was, I don't understand why people think that shot couldn't happen. It could easily happen.
so easily he could have been shot from the back and be on the way falling down and received another shot to the head.
That's the way I conclude it happened. Willard says he was shot simultaneously pretty much in the back and the face at the same time. And so as he shot in the back, that's when he uttered the words, "I'm a dead man." Because if he'd been shot in the face, he wouldn't be able to talk. But he's shot in the back, starts to drop to his knees. The ball comes through the door panel, hits him in the face. He falls over on his back. And all the eyewitnesses concluded that Hyrum fell on his back and never moved until his body was removed from the jail later in the day. So.
Thank you so much. This has been very informative. We will now go on to the other part of our panel here, but I think it's been very enlightening to help us understand the forensics that was displayed to us from Justin, and then what we can see. Now, in the future, we will try to go through and actually reenact more with forensics and show you how they're accurate, the proper way to do that. But at this time, we will not. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your time to do that. Any last questions?
Thank you.
No questions, Kimberly?
Oh, yeah, I'm good. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
All right, thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Jim and Sam, for doing that. Now, at this time, we're going to turn the time over to Taylor Smith. I want you to introduce yourself, Taylor, and talk to us a little bit about what you're going to present to us, because I think this is very important.
Absolutely. I'm just a son of the Restoration. I have been born and raised in the church. I've always had a testimony. My parents and grandparents instilled in me at a very young age a love of the gospel, the fullness, the restoration, and I've just been a student my whole life. I'm just glad to be here. I will say that I am not an unbiased presenter tonight. I think all of us would acknowledge that we're very biased, and that's because we all have a testimony. And so why shouldn't we stand for what we believe in? My bias, back when I was a kid, I've always had a favorable impression of John Taylor because my first name is Taylor. So I'm not by blood any relation of John Taylor, but I've always felt kind of a connection through the common name that we share. And then my last name is Smith. I'm a first cousin of Joseph and Hyrum, 6 generations removed, related to many of the founding generation of this dispensation, this restoration. And so, yeah, I do take it very personally when somebody makes accusations involving my ancestors. So what I'd like to do today, I mean, thank you everybody who's presented for the very thorough analysis of the historical record, the forensic investigation, and the complete lack of professional approach that has been taken in the films produced by Justin Griffin. But I don't want to get too much tunnel vision on this. And so, let me share my screen real quick. This is a presentation that I've prepared. And if you guys could give me a thumbs up, confirm you see my screen. Okay, so what I'd like to do is take a step back from the moment, because as many of us are aware, Justin Griffin is not the first, nor will he be the last person who's going to come out and try to deceive people, try to do things to undermine faith and try to fight against the gospel, the church, and so forth. So this is just a scriptural analysis to help us get some tools to learn how to discern and withstand the wolves in sheep's clothing in the last days, and just to kind of, in essence, give us a foundation for this whole effort of this presentation, and then, of course, my presentation here. I'd like to quote from Jude chapter 1, verse 3. He says, "Beloved, when I gave all diligence to write unto you of the common salvation, it was needful for me to write unto you and exhort you, that you should earnestly contend for the faith which was once delivered unto the saints." So we often have a bias against quote unquote contention or debate. But I wanted to mention this verse to draw the contrast between the spirit of contention and contention itself. If we did not contend earnestly for the faith which was once delivered unto us, what would be the result? We would just have accusations unanswered. We would be mocked. We'd be persecuted. We'd be driven and slaughtered. I mean, we have to defend the faith. This is an attribute of all saints throughout all generations. C.S. Lewis once said, "Good exist if for no other reason than to answer bad philosophy." And so with that kind of opening, we're going to dive right into some scriptural examples. Now, these scriptural examples are, in context, they happen before the birth of Christ. And so they're universally referred to as antichrists. But I don't want to get this idea that all wolves are going to deny the divinity of Christ. This happened before Christ had come. And so it was very easy for people to say, you can't know what's going to happen in the future. So beginning here with the instance of Hyrum. This comes from the Book of Mormon, Jacob, chapter 7. And we're just going to briefly touch on a few of these highlights. I've got the screen up. He speaks flattery. He's trying to overthrow doctrine. He leads away hearts. In other words, he's appealing to emotions and trying to manipulate people and their emotions. Perfect knowledge of language. So he's really good at communicating and maybe not necessarily linguistically speaking, but he knew what words to use, what language to use to get the most effect, to draw people over to his opinions. And he also claims in verse 10, you can see here on the screen, he claims to believe in the scriptures. He seeks a sign. And then at the end, that it says that he was deceived by the power of the devil. So this actually has a happy ending, not necessarily for Hyrum personally, but for the rest of the people, because after he is rebuked, he acknowledges openly, "I've lied unto God, I denied Christ, and said I believe the scriptures." So this all actually happened according to Jacob's desire because he prayed for it. So this is the first quick example. At the end of after I go through these examples as quickly as I can, I'm going to kind of summarize what the kind of the patterns, the principles that we can extract from these examples, and then we'll discuss from there. So the second example comes from the book of Alma, chapter 1. This is a man named Nehor, and he goes about preaching what he terms to be the word of God, bearing down against the church. So again, he claims to be preaching truth, and he's fighting against the church. And in verse 4, this is interesting because he basically says that in the end, all men should have eternal life. What I would extract from this is it's the idea of pleasing doctrines. He says messages that people like to hear. This is why moral relativism is so persuasive these days, because it's unpleasant to think that some people are right and others are wrong. It's much easier to just say, well, everybody's right, and it's just your truth, and it's my truth, and it's his truth and her truth. And we deny the objective realities when we indulge in those types of things, but it is very appealing to our emotions and so forth. In verse 5, he gets a lot of support. He begins to pull a lot of people into his message, and they give him money. So again, these are just some of these attributes and patterns that we can see. He begins to establish a church after the manner of his preaching. Now, beginning in verse 7, he encounters some opposition. So this, again, going back to Jude chapter 1, verse 3, we have been commissioned to contend earnestly for our faith that was once delivered, the restoration in our case. And Gideon, who was a leader of the church, he was actually the same Gideon who served as the general of Captain or King Limhi, the son of wicked King Noah. They were slaves to the Lamanites, and Gideon was instrumental in forming the idea, the stratagem that was enabled them to escape that oppression from the Lamanites. So Gideon stands up to him and confounds him, and basically, because of this, Nehor becomes so angry, he kills Gideon. And so he thinks he can get away with this, but Alma, of course, holds his feet to the fire and says, you've introduced priestcraft, and you've endeavored to enforce it by the sword. And again, this one has a good ending as well for the Nephites, but not necessarily for Nehor personally, because he also was caused, or rather did acknowledge before God and the men on earth, that what he had taught was contrary to the word of God. And then he was executed for his crime of murder. So unfortunately, this didn't end the spreading of priestcraft. There were many who loved the vain things of the world and went forth preaching false doctrines for the sake of riches and honor. Now, the last key point here is that in verse 24, the hearts of many of the people were hardened, and their names were blotted out, that they were remembered no more among the people of God. And also many withdrew themselves from among them. So this is a reference to excommunication. People obviously were excommunicated when their hearts were hardened, and they were following these evil teachings, and they were not remembered among the people, and many withdrew their records from the people as well. So the reason this is important is because many people, Justin Griffin included, like to play a martyr and try to claim that, well, I just have these questions, I have these doubts, and they kicked me out. Like, how, poor me, playing this martyr to try to appeal to people's emotions and manipulate people. And that's not an injustice when certain criteria are met. Well, if we have time, we can dive into those here at the end. Moving on into the third example, this is Amlici. Now, Amlici is kind of, it referenced at the end of the previous chapter. He is of the order of Nehors. So he's a follower of Nehor. He's cunning, verse 1, and wise as to the wisdom of the world. So he's maybe well-trained, well-educated. Who knows exactly what that meant, but, we can draw the parallels to our time. And he is so persuasive, he draws many people after him, and they began to be very powerful. So powerful, in fact, that he thinks that he can take over the government. And but they have the big vote, and the voice of the people reject Amlici. They do not want him to be their king. His goal in becoming king was so that he could destroy the church and deprive people of their rights and privileges. When he loses the big election, he does not just take the L and move on. He's a very poor loser. In fact, he stirs up his supporters to anger against the opposition, and they make him king anyway. It leads to war, it leads to destruction of their freedom, and this also has a good ending, but not without a lot of tragedy. So it ends up becoming a great war. Many people are killed. But because of the faithfulness and the prayers of the righteous Nephites, even after the Amlicites form a confederacy with the Lamanite army that they come across as they're fleeing out of the land, the Nephites still are able to prevail. So it's very miraculous. But there is a price attached to that. The final example I want to dive into, and then we'll recap all of these kind of patterns and principles here. Alma chapter 30 has the story of Korihor. Now, Korihor, so one of the things that the Nephite law protected was freedom of conscience, the ability to believe as you felt led. And there were strict laws against, wicked actions, like sinful actions, such as murder, theft, robbery, adultery, etc. But they protected the freedom of conscience and belief. Now, Korihor knew about this, and he exploited it. He basically exploits this freedom and tries to hide his true agenda, his true intention behind just expressing his belief. So, without reading all of the things, just jumping down here in verse 12, the law could have no hold upon him. He begins to preach. In verse 13, O ye that are bound down under a foolish and a vain hope, why do ye yoke yourselves with such foolish things? Now, this is really basically implying that the people who believe in the church are in bondage. They're slaves, and he's mocking the faith that they have. And so basically, those are just a couple of things. These things which he called prophecies, they're foolish traditions. He's just, again, mocking and making disparaging comments. How do you know of their surety? You cannot know of things you do not see. So again, requiring empirical or physical evidence before he would be willing to believe in something. At the effect of a frenzied mind. And this derangement of your minds comes because of the traditions leading you into false beliefs. He just almost every other sentence just can't help but mock and say these basically you're crazy types of dismissive remarks against the people's faith, and again accuses them of being in bondage, and that these ancient prophecies are just intended to enslave and enrich the leadership. So making a lot of accusations and claiming that these are just whims, visions, and pretended mysteries. Now, Alma sees right through him. He has the Spirit of God, and in verse 42, he says, I know that thou believest, but thou art possessed with a lying spirit. Ye have put off the Spirit of God, that it may have no place in you. The devil has power over you. He doth carry you about working devices that he may destroy the children of God. So Korihor then reverts to, then show me, prove it. And he asks for a sign. And he says that he will deny. Alma's like, I'm grieved because of the hardness of your heart, and your soul's going to be destroyed. But it's better that your soul should be destroyed than that you would be the means of bringing many souls down to destruction. And he gives him one more chance to back off. And Korihor's response is, he kind of tries to gaslight. He tries to change what he said so in verse 48 it says, I do not deny the existence of a God, but I do not believe that there is a God. And I say also, ye do not know that there is a God, and except ye show me a sign, I will not believe. So he's gaslighting. He's trying to kind of backpedal, but just hide behind this ruse of, I just have some doubts. I'm just asking questions. Okay. Now, the end of the rest of the story is Alma says, okay, so be it. And Korihor is struck dumb, and he acknowledges that nothing save it were the power of God could have brought this upon me. And then he admits, I always knew there was a God. The devil hath deceived me. He appeared unto me in the form of an angel and said, go and reclaim this people. They've all gone astray after an unknown God. This, I think, is really key, because there are maybe, I don't know if any claims made personally by Justin Griffin, but many people he has associated and affiliated himself with, as well as many other people in recent memory, have made claims that they have, seen Christ or had experiences with angelic ministrations and so forth. And when I first started encountering these things, I just kind of, dismissed them because, well, you have to be in the Quorum of 12 or you have to be in the First Presidency. And so I just didn't just kind of disbelieve them out of hand. And but I think that it's important to note, maybe they are having true visitations. Maybe it's just not of God. And the importance, I mean, this is actually goes back to the beginning of this restoration, of the dispensation. There were many people who were deceived by angelic or spiritual manifestations and visions, and the Doctrine and Covenants, section 50 and various other places, completely addresses those historical experiences and gives us keys by which we can discern them. So I just, for the sake of time, going to wrap up this final example. And one thing is just to note that after Korihor was cursed and acknowledges his flaws, it's published throughout all the land. So, and it convinces many people they were converted to the Lord. And thus we see the end of him who perverteth the ways of the Lord. Thus we see the devil will not support his children at the last day, but speedily drags them down to hell. So just as a quick summary, I'm going to read through these quickly, but we've already kind of pulled out many of them. Common attributes and tactics of wolves wearing sheep's clothing is they rail against doctrines and ordinances. They rail against God's laws. They play the martyr. In other words, they claim they've been unjustly dealt with to try to gain sympathy. They mock testimony and require empirical evidence. They make accusations against church leaders without evidence. They make bold challenges to face off against church leaders. They mock and dismiss spiritual experiences. They claim laws and ordinances are imposed to subjugate and exploit people to enrich the leaders. They claim anyone who has a testimony is a liar. They claim that church members who reject their message are victims and slaves. They twist scriptures and use logical fallacies to push their agenda, to manipulate emotion. They seek signs. They hide behind excuses like I'm just asking questions or I just have some doubts in order to appear or pretend that they're sincere and honest. They can be easily angered and contentious, sometimes even violent. They teach pleasing doctrines that people like and want to believe. They're cunning and successful at deceiving many people using crafty language and flattery. They willfully and aggressively try to recruit followers and destroy true faith and the church. And finally, they're always exposed as liars sooner or later. So there's one quick thing I want to address, which is this idea that Denver Snuffer or Justin Griffin or I don't know what the status of everybody else is, but many people have been excommunicated who has begun to make claims such as this. And they like to pretend that they were unjustly dealt with to try to garner sympathy and seduce people to follow after them. I want to really quick remind us of section 42 of the Doctrine and Covenants, which God himself declares this is the law of the church in the latter days. And it says that there are certain crimes which, when committed and if you don't repent of them, merit excommunication: stealing, lying, lust, or adultery. And there's some criteria that should be met: evil speaking. And in 28, it's just really a catch-all: he that sinneth. Whatever the sin is, if you don't repent, God requires the church to excommunicate those individuals. And this is my law unto my church, and he that doeth them not shall be damned if he so continue. Now, the authorities, the penalties should be enforced are very important. There's ecclesiastical authority and there's civil authority, like the government or the law of the land. Now, the civil law is the punisher or the enforcer of things like robbery, theft, lying, but those laws have penalties that are in the civil code. In the ecclesiastical authorities, though, the ultimate punishment is excommunication. And now, when should the church exercise this penalty? Well, in verse 88, if thy brother or sister offend thee, thou shalt take him or her between him or her and thee alone. And if he or she confess, thou shalt be reconciled. So giving offense is maybe not something that the civil authorities would have anything to do with. I mean, I guess you could try to sue people or whatever, but this is actually a church consideration. Now, if you confront somebody who's offended thee and they don't confess, thou shalt deliver him or her up unto the church, not to the members, but to the elders. And it shall be in a meeting, not before the world. In other words, this sounds a lot like a disciplinary council amongst like the stake presidency or the high council, okay? A kind of a closed door meeting. And it's not intended to keep things secret. It's to protect the privacy of the individuals involved. Because maybe there is a misunderstanding. Maybe there's not enough witnesses. Maybe they're just doing an investigation and they want to do their due diligence. That is why these meetings are kept private and confidential. Now, there are lines though. If you cross the line in verse 90, and if thy brother or sister offend many, he or she shall be chastened before many. And if anyone offend openly, he shall be rebuked openly, that he or she may be ashamed. And if he confess not, he shall be delivered up unto the law of God and excommunicated and publicly, criticized and rebuked. So this is not something that, the church just came up with recently because they wanted to persecute Denver Snuffer or Justin Griffin or whoever, Phil Davis, whoever. This is literally the law of the church revealed by God through Joseph Smith in section 42 in the early founding of the church in this dispensation. So in the next thing I want to cover really quickly is in part 2 of Justin Griffin. Now, a quick little bit of background for me. I've never met Justin Griffin in person. I had never heard of Justin Griffin until I heard of his movie, part 1 of the film. And when I first heard it or first watched it, I had already investigated this years prior because of an old like VHS quality recording. And what happened was I just was shocked that anybody was listening to it because it was so obviously debunked as far as ballistically, historically, etc. I guess I forgot to mention that I'm also a long distance shooter. It's one of my hobbies. I have too many kids now to do it as much as I would like, but I've studied ballistics. I've shot long distances and done some training in that regard. So the claims that were being made, I knew from firsthand experience to be provably false. But I saw people, close friends, family members, people I loved and cared about being seduced by some of these arguments. And it made me angry, to be honest. And I was just like, I was kind of a little bit angry that people were willing to believe these things without doing their own due diligence and looking into the homework. But I was also extremely upset that somebody would go to the trouble because, in my opinion, he had to have known he was lying. Well, so I connected with Kimberly Smith and my brother-in-law. We had a conversation because there was really little answer out there on the internet to the part 1 for at least for several months. And so we got together, we had a conversation in which Kimberly had a lot of background on this movement, Doctrine of Christ, Justin Griffin personally, and was able to share it. And we uploaded it. It then got the attention of Justin Griffin. And it was over 2 hours, like 2 hours and 15, 20 minutes. He took 10 minutes of it, created a movie in which he quote unquote debunked us. He spent 40 minutes talking about this 10-minute clip from the over 2 hours. And really, it was in his movie, he mentioned, well, I'd be willing to sit down with these people and have a conversation. So I commented on his movie. And long story short, we ended up having our own conversation. And I went into my first round of debate with Justin Griffin open. And because I had never met him, I had never heard from his mouth. And I had been kind of reliant upon Kimberly's experiences to inform my own opinion. And so I just let him talk. And as he would talk, I would ask him some probing questions. And it came out, one of the things that we had said in our movie was Justin Griffin has ties to a man named Phil Davis and the Doctrine of Christ movement. And he denied that initially, said that I was misrepresenting that, but then he, in the end, acknowledged it. One of the other things I criticized that he presented himself as a faithful member of the church at the beginning of his documentary. because he had been affiliating with Phil Davis and had these very, bizarre opinions and beliefs for a long time. And anyway, he acknowledged that. And so he made concession after concession. By the end of the first 2-hour segment, he had basically admitted everything that he claimed we had falsely accused him of on camera. And this is on my YouTube channel. This is something that is on the record. Anybody can go and validate what I'm saying. At the end, we actually decided to have a second part on a different day, and he challenged me to come up with my own theory, which I did. And spoiler alert, it's basically just the eyewitnesses' testimony, but presented with enough modern technological and ballistics and forensic best practices and industry standards based off of the modern science, that at the end of me presenting this theory to him, all he could say was, wow, that's a good theory. He had nothing to say against it. And so I wanted to just preface that real quick in his part 2. Now, in part 2, these are timestamps here on the left. At the 4-minute, 30-second mark, he says, none of the critics mentioned any of the evidence I presented in the film. And at the 5-minute mark, he says, now we can talk about the evidence, like he was, saying he was excited. And it never happened. They just ignored it.
And Taylor,
and I can tell you,
can I just jump in here?
Yeah.
I also had a debate. I went on another show on YouTube called Midnight Mormons, and we talked for an hour and a half, and then he joined us for the last hour. And he had no answers to the points, historical points. So for him to say that, nobody's challenged him, you've challenged him twice, it's on YouTube. I've challenged him, it's there. I don't think it's a truthful statement, in my opinion, when he says in movie 2, nobody's disputed, because both of us have publicly with him.
Yeah, absolutely. On the record. And one interesting thing about that. So when I first finished up my first round of debate with Justin Griffin, we both uploaded it on our respective YouTube channels. And then when we finished part 2, I believe I uploaded it. I don't know if I ever confirmed that he uploaded it. If he did, it has now been removed from his channel. And part 1 of our debate has been set to private. So you can't watch my interview with him on his channel, but you can go to The Gospel Unscripted on YouTube, which is my channel, and check it out. So these are just, again, blatant lies, deceptions. Kimberly as well has had many firsthand dealings with him and challenged him, and we've never shied away from the evidence. I mean, especially like in my case, I don't have a ton of experience, but I wouldn't say I'm an expert, but I do have some experience in long distance shooting. So we were able to discuss the ballistics that he loves to obsess about. Now at the 10-minute, 45-second mark, moving on, he's just having this really cringy reenactment of his excommunication with his wife. And he's like, we told them we believed in the Book of Mormon and the Restoration, but none of that mattered. Again, playing the martyr. So these are, again, trying to apply these principles. This is just a case study. These are principles that we could apply to anybody, past, present, or future, that comes in as a wolf in sheep's clothing trying to deceive and destroy the flock. But Justin Griffin checks a lot of these boxes, is my point. And he's trying to generate sympathy. And then again, in the 20-minute, 20-second mark, again, he makes this statement where his wife asks him, what if you're wrong? And he says, I guess I'd have to admit I was wrong and apologize. Again, these are staged conversations that were inserted. Maybe they really happened, but he's reenacting them on the camera. It's just really cringy, in my opinion, that he would do those types of things, and it's calculated to manipulate and have this emotional appeal to try to generate sympathy. Now, Matt Steiner, as the forensic detective at the 36-minute, 30-second timestamp, says, I don't think any of the theories can be proven in court, and proceeds to basically say, I think your theory is not valid. And he comes up with his own theory in which the mob is responsible for killing Joseph and Hyrum. Now, Justin Griffin, kind of exposing his bad faith, says at the 41-minute, 20-second timestamp, obviously, I haven't won him over completely. Not yet. There's still more work to do. So he is not sincere. He's not interested in truth. If he was, he would have at that point taken a step back and reevaluated his position and his agenda. In contrast, he just reveals that he's on this crusade to try to push people to accept his theory, no matter what it takes. So at the 45-minute, 30-second timestamp, so far the only theory I've personally seen that is still standing is the inside job theory. Okay, well, what about my theory, Justin, that you said, wow, that was a good theory about? So that is, again, just a lie. Now, this is interesting. At the 45-minute, 45-second timestamp, he admits, he has a moment of honesty. My motivation has evolved over time. And at the 46-minute, 30-second timestamp, he says, I got excommunicated for presenting his theory. My motivation since his excommunication has been to vindicate myself. So he comes right out and admits it. He's on a crusade. He thinks he was unjustly dealt with, and he's trying to do everything he can possibly think of to justify himself and rail against this injustice that the church has made him. He's playing the martyr. Again, going back to those principles that we looked at from the Book of Mormon scriptural examples. At the 1 hour, 4 minute, and 4 second account, so Justin, he's got this big book out, and he's in front of the camera, and he's saying, I've read the history now. He brings up the Samuel Jones account that Joseph and Hyrum were murdered by friends. Why I wanted to point this out is that A, he got the name wrong. It's not Samuel Jones, it's Samuel James. B, he's writing a letter to Willard Richards, of all people. And, it's ironic if he was as Justin Griffin presents it in his film, you'd think that Samuel Jones was revealing some huge, solving this big mystery that Joseph and Hyrum were murdered by friends. Well, why would you write that to one of the friends that you think that was responsible for killing Joseph and Hyrum? I mean, it is so cherry-picked and out of context. And then the third thing that, C, so A, Samuel James, B, letter written by Samuel James to Willard, C, it could have been a typological or a transcriptural error. The letter R in the word may or may not be there in the original. It's kind of hard to tell with the handwriting, but it could very well have said Joseph and Hyrum were murdered by fiends, not friends. And even if it said friends, Samuel James could easily have been referring to William and Wilson Law. William was in the first presidency. Francis and Chauncey Higby, Robert Foster. These are former close associates and church leaders. They were in his most inner circle, like his trusted friends.
Yeah,
so
established that they were involved with the conspiracy there in Nauvoo. There's no doubt in the evidence of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So Justin is either lying about how much history he's actually read, which I'm open to that possibility, or he is lying about and intentionally misrepresenting this statement in his presentation in the video. Either way, he's lying. So, and then the last couple of things at the 1 hour, 13-minute, 57 timestamp, he claims, quote, I've invited multiple LDS historians for an interview and they all refused. And the invitation still stands. No, actually, when I was coordinating my debate with Justin Griffin, he actually almost backed out of the first debate with him because, and I have this all in email in writing from Justin Griffin. He said, I don't want Kimberly Watson Smith on the call. And he's like, if she's going to be on the call, I'm out. And I mean, it's a little crazy that he was so afraid of Kim. I mean, she's a woman and she's so nice, but when she's got his number because she knows the history, and so he was unwilling to have the meeting with me if Kimberly was going to be present. So I talked to Kim, we worked it out, and she was able to listen in but was not speaking at all, and we respected that request. But Shannon Tracy, Sam Weston, various of us have had these conversations, and Justin Griffin has been running. Yeah. So anyway.
So Taylor, I think what we do here officially right now, Justin, we are challenging you to come and debate and talk about all the points that we have discussed in this panel. We want to start with the historical perspective, and we want you to go point by point and show where they are wrong. And you've run away from the historical perspective and all the historical documentation up until this point. We no longer allow you to hide in the shadows, in the gray spaces, the dark spaces. We challenge you to come before us and try to refute the evidence which we have produced here. And believe me, there is more than what we have produced here, and there are many more people we could add to the panel. So if you are so strongly aware what you are standing by is truthful, come forth and meet us, or at least go truthfully through the documentation that we presented here and show where we have erred. And I think that's why you've run away from the historical documentation. You say it's not necessary. All that's necessary is the forensic analysis. Well, forensic analysis only stands on the historical perspective and documentation. And so we challenge you to come forth. And I think everybody here will shake their head and say, we're willing to meet you. And we will not hide in the shadows. We will hide in a well-lit room, and we'll discuss the facts and show light on these facts going forward.
And Shannon, if I just take a quick second, I'd just like to close by just saying, I just want to bear my testimony. And if it's to Justin Griffin, then that's great, Justin. I live in the same town as you, by the way. I'm down here in Manti. Great little place. But I just want to say, you know, I don't think it was by chance that 2 men survived to tell the story and 2 men died, because we have here in the church, we all know this, when we go do any ordinance, we have 2 witnesses present. And I think the Savior knows that someday those mob members are going to have to answer for what they did. And even Jesus said, you know, their offenses will come, but woe to those who offenses come. And I feel for those men, I really do, that were there in the mob. I really feel for them because they have a lot to answer for. But I really feel like the law of witnesses says, into the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses shall all the truth be known. And isn't it interesting that throughout the day, all these men were lost or were pushed out of Carthage, and we ended up with 4 people. 2 of them died, and the other 2, who were the only apostles in the state of Illinois at the time, were there as apostles of the Savior Jesus Christ to be the final 2 witnesses. And John Taylor could have very easily passed away, but the Lord preserved his life to go on to not only be a witness, but to become the 3rd president of the church. And so the Lord has his hand in things, and he's going to continue to have his hand in things. So, you know, I hope, Justin, that you can maybe have a change of heart and come back and see the truth. And I bear that witness in the name of Christ.
Amen.
Taylor, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Did you have anything else you wanted to part words with?
Just one final point, and then I'll close with my testimony. Thank you, Craig. That was beautiful. So at the 1 hour, 27-minute timestamp, he finally introduces his anti-polygamy narrative. Now, Kimberly and Smith and I and others have been predicting this since we first watched his part 1, because this is where it always gets. This is where it always goes. There's a guy, Ronald Karen, who wrote a book called The Exoneration of Joseph and Emma Smith, who I debated in person, or directly. It wasn't in person, but it was over Facebook. But he and I had some debates. And yet another guy who follows a lot of these scriptural patterns and, you know, was checking a lot of these boxes, similar to Justin Griffin. But the thing that's significant about this anti-polygamy narrative is he finally admits his true agenda, which is to deny the fullness of the ordinances of the gospel. If you deny polygamy, you deny celestial marriage, because the same revelation that talks about eternal marriage, you know, this lovely idea of being with my spouse for eternity, is the same as section 132. And if you reject what section 132, well, how can you claim to like or keep the part that you like, this idea of being with your spouse for eternity, but I don't like the icky stuff like polygamy or whatever, or the laws upon which these blessings are predicated. And so this is ultimately a rejection of the temple and its ordinances. And so these are the crowning ordinances of the restoration. The temple is the fullness of the gospel, the fullness of the priesthood. Joseph was very clear about that in his lifetime. And the RLDS church doesn't do it. You know, various other breakoffs don't do it. The saints that followed Brigham Young and the Quorum of the 12 are the group, the body that preserved these crowning ordinances of the restoration. So if you don't like polygamy, I mean, that's again a pleasing doctrine. People love to have this idea that, well, I can believe in the restoration, I can believe in Joseph, and I don't have to believe in the icky polygamy stuff. The problem with that is it really undermines the restoration. And so in conclusion, there are deceivers and hypocrites in the church. There has been since the 1830s. This is section 50 from the Doctrine and Covenants. And the Lord warns deceivers and hypocrites because they will be brought to judgment. Maybe not in this life, but God's promises will be fulfilled. The hypocrites who have deceived some gives the adversary power. Now, if anybody listening to this presentation has a family member or a loved one, a friend that has been affected by these types of seducers, these deceivers, these wolves, this is a beautiful promise in verse 7. Such shall be reclaimed. Now, it doesn't say it's in this life. I don't know when the Lord will deliver on this promise, but we can keep that hope that if people are sincere and they're just deceived, they can be reclaimed. But in verse 8, this is the really strong warning. The hypocrites shall be detected and cut off, and woe unto those who are cut off from the church, for they are overcome of the world. Let every man beware, lest he do that not, which is not in truth and righteousness before me. And so I'll just close with my testimony that John Taylor is, when I was a kid, I didn't know much about John Taylor, but as I've grown into adulthood, partially because of my sharing his name being named after John Taylor, I've studied, and also just because I became fascinated by some of the history that's been largely forgotten by my generation. John Taylor is one of the very few men in this dispensation that we have positive evidence that, both through his recorded testimony and other people's recorded testimony, that John Taylor was anointed under Christ's hand. We also have his fruits, because Christ said, by their fruits you shall know them. John Taylor met the Savior. He was ordained under his hand. He recorded various thus saith the Lord revelations. He led the church. He was the president after Brigham Young's death. These are wonderful fruits. He was a good husband, a great father. I mean, he was a good man. This is not the fruits of a murderer. Can an evil tree bring forth good fruit? No. Can a good tree bring forth evil fruit? No. So, some people that may be listening to this presentation have made a covenant before God to not speak evil of the Lord's anointed. And I can't think of a more heinous way to speak evil of a man than to falsely accuse him of murder. And God's going to require an accounting from everybody, whether we realize it or admit it or not. If we violate his laws, we should repent. And like Craig invited Justin, if you're listening to this right now, please repent, because like your wife said, what if you're wrong? It's my testimony, you are wrong. And it'd be much better for you to repent now than to be held to account in the judgment day ahead by God. So that's all I have. Thanks.
Thank you, Taylor. So, Brian, is there anything you wanted to say before we turn the time?
I want to thank you, everybody, for spending their time, and Shannon for putting this together. I do echo that if you follow what some people might call the succession crisis, there was no crisis at all. It was pretty clear. If you follow that out, where did the keys that Joseph had, that he got in the Kirtland Temple, where did they go? And they went west with Brigham Young and the church, and the temple work and the work of salvation for the dead. And that whole concept that Joseph revealed so beautifully in Nauvoo only went with the saints that went with Brigham Young. And it's in the church today. And you have different splinter groups, breakoffs, startups, whatever, that all tie back to Joseph Smith, and they do not have the keys of the priesthood, and they do not have the temple work and the salvation for the dead that was so critical. And those are the fruits that we need to look at. Who has the keys? Who has the temple work? Who has the truth? And it's the church that's based in Salt Lake with Russell Nelson as the prophet, seer, and revelator as of today. And that's my testimony in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Hey, Kimberly, did you want to bring us home?
Sure. Let's see here. I don't know where it says to share my screen.
Down at the bottom, it's that
Okay.
red box.
Very good at this. Okay, so we see that the blatant attack on the martyrdom draws a line in the sand for those who love the law of God and feel a loyalty to the Lord and his servants in the latter days. We live in possibly the most deceptive time in the history of the earth. It has been prophesied that even the very elect are and will be deceived. Satan's arguments are the more articulate and more cleverly advanced than possibly at any other time. So I just want us to stop and think, why does this matter? Why did we come together as a panel to bear witness of the restoration and of the martyrdom of Joseph Smith? What are the implications? In June of 1844, the prophet Joseph Smith said, "It is thought by some that our enemies would be satisfied with my destruction, but I will tell you that as soon as they shed my blood, they will thirst for the blood of every man in whose heart dwells a single spark of the spirit of the fullness of the gospel. The opposition of these men is moved by the spirit of the adversary of all righteousness. It is not only to destroy me, but every man and woman who dares believe the doctrines that God hath inspired me to teach in this generation." So the death of Joseph Smith is under attack by those who do not understand the importance of the restoration. The docudrama Who Killed Joseph Smith makes a mockery of the deaths of Joseph and his brother Hyrum. If the martyrdom is reduced to just a crime scene, it destroys the full value of the restoration. I think it's critical for each of us to understand that in the latter days, the Lord chose his greatest prophet to rule over the house of Israel. And the work and the mission of Joseph Smith have been known to all holy prophets since the world began. He was known by both name and family to the ancient prophets who described his role in gathering of Israel, in bringing forth the Book of Mormon, in adding to the canon of Scripture with personal revelations and restoring other ancient scriptural texts. Every single prophet of dispensations past have surrounded the prophet Joseph Smith, dictating the great work that he would do. Such decrees had to be fulfilled to the very letter, and so it has been. More prophecy was fulfilled in the lifetime of Joseph Smith than had been for nearly 2,000 years before, including his death. And the Lord even tells Joseph Smith while he's in Liberty Jail, "Thy days are known, and thy years shall not be numbered less." The death of the prophet Joseph Smith is a fulfillment of prophecy. In August 1842, Joseph Smith said, "My feelings at the present time are that inasmuch as the Lord has preserved me until today, he will continue to preserve me by the united faith and prayers of the saints until I have fully accomplished my mission in this life and so firmly established the dispensation of the fullness of the priesthood in the last days, that all the powers of earth and hell can never prevail against it." In October of 1843, the prophet said, "I defy all the world to destroy the work of God, and I prophesy they will never have power to kill me till my work is accomplished and I am ready to die." Then in May of 1844, the prophet again said, "God will always protect me until my mission is fulfilled." In June of 1844, right before the martyrdom, the prophet Joseph Smith said to the saints, "I do not regard my life. I'm ready to be offered a sacrifice for this people. For what can our enemies do? Only kill the body, and their power is then at an end. Stand firm, my friends, never flinch. Do not seek to save your lives, for he that is afraid to die for the truth will lose eternal life. Hold out to the end, and we shall be resurrected and become like gods and reign in celestial kingdoms, principalities, and eternal dominions." So why did Joseph Smith have to die? Because, like Jesus Christ, Joseph Smith gave his life and shed his blood as his final testament. And just prior to his death, the prophet Joseph Smith declared, I have to seal my testimony with my blood. I have to do it. For this work will never progress until I am gone. For the testimony is of no force until the testator is dead. And according to Paul in the New Testament, blood must be shed as the price of freedom of truth, and most of all, as the price of the witness of Jesus Christ. In Hebrews chapter 9, we read, For a testament is of force after men are dead, otherwise it is of no strength at all while the testator liveth. Whereupon neither the first testament was dedicated without blood. And it is significant to note that in the Joseph Smith translation, the word testament is replaced with the word covenant. The covenant of the restoration has been sealed in this dispensation by the blood of the two prophets. And I testify that the death of Joseph Smith is the fulfillment of the hundreds of years of ancient biblical prophecy.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. That's very wonderful. So in conclusion, we implore all those who are listening to this, and we thank you so much for taking the time to come to the end. We know that we do not have the glamour of the presentation that Justin has. We are trying to show the light into the dark places. We bear testimony that Joseph Smith was and is the prophet of this dispensation. No other man can claim that. No other man has given more for the benefit of the saints in the past and now. I bear this testimony that I know that Joseph Smith is the prophet of the restoration, and that we will all be better for that as we understand and embrace that and understand the gospel principle of happiness, which he has explored. We thank you very much, and look forward for some more podcasts and videos that we're going to produce through the Voices of the Restoration, which will also help us understand key points and times in the restoration and shown light on the true historical perspective and the voices of those who testify of the truth from their voices, both Joseph Smith, all the founders. So hopefully we will be able to give more of those in the future, and you can find those on our channel, which is Voices of the Restoration. We're building that up. It's not there yet. Have patience with us and we will get there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.